One of the most obvious pieces of evidence to me is whenever we go across the land and we see beautiful buildings like this, such as the state capitol in Iowa. This is the baseline building for my research on this channel, and the reason for that, it's a building that shouldn't exist there. I think of civilizations as running up a tower. You're always looking to get to the top of the tower as fast as you can, and you're expending a lot of energy to do so. But think of all the previous civilizations that have existed in our lands. I suspect there's 5 eras, but there could be many more. What happens when they reach the top of the tower? Are they able to stay at the top of the tower, or do they fall? Greetings. The 5 eras theory is one of the theories that I use to try to formulate and visualize how the lands could have looked in the past. We have no idea what the actual history is. Yes, we're given a historical account, but we have many inconsistencies in it and we see many contradictions. The portion of the 5 eras theory that I bring up here, though, is dividing it up into looking at how our civilization came to where it is. We start with the Golden Age. And the Golden Age consists of the first 3 eras. Now, there are many cultures that have a division of 5 eras that are across the land, and this is the reason why I picked 5 eras. I don't know. There could be many more, there could be many less. Many things were possible in the Golden Age. Human beings were much more advanced and much more developed spiritually, and they could achieve great architectural achievements. I also believe that in the 3rd era is where the star fort builders came from. We're now in our contemporary age, or what others might call the Iron Age, or we jokingly refer to as the Plastic Age. And we call it that because everything is very disposable. And it seems as though we can feel internally that this era that we live in now does not match what was in the past. Although we'll be ridiculed for this, even though there's a lot of evidence that suggests otherwise. Today we're going to be looking at the Tartarian Age, or the 4th era. Now, I call this the Tartarian Age, and there are many alternative researchers that are saying we shouldn't be using this term all the time. It's just a name that's associated with it, a worldwide civilization that existed before our own. But what did it really look like? Well, we have to go back and revisualize the other eras. The first era, the Golden Age, where pretty much anything was possible, where human beings lived exceptionally long lifetimes, and they had an infinite spiritual health. They understood themselves, they understood their environment, and they existed in a wonderful balance with it. Not the promises of balances, but true balances. And their architectural achievements were stunning. They could build buildings that reached to the very clouds, and who knows, perhaps the very nature of the land is very different than we can imagine. It's not just buildings, it could have been vast flora and fauna that existed. And there's a reason why they try to tie this in with explanations of things existing many millions of years ago. But who knows what the actual timeline is? Was this first era of the Golden Age 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago? We don't really have any way to know. And the only remnants we see of this are in great rocks and in certain areas of the land where we have hints of once great buildings that existed in the very distant past. Or maybe it wasn't such a distant past after all, because the forces that destroyed these buildings and leveled the land are things that we cannot understand. But we can certainly speculate on them. The whole point behind the first era of the Golden Age is to understand that in the very beginning, we believe that human beings were exceptionally developed. Now, this theory could be completely wrong, but the evidence that backs it up is whenever you go across the land and you find evidence of melted buildings, vast structures that once covered the land. And on this channel, we explored the Castle Rock ruins in Wisconsin, and we saw that there were hints of vast structures that once existed there that had to be larger than we could possibly imagine. We also see structures such as Devil's Tower. It may have once been a large tree, or it may have once been a large structure, or something else. In the second era, we postulate a civilization that existed, rising from the ashes of the first era. Now, others may call this the Silver Age, and we'll review what this really was when we look at the Greek theory of the 5 ages. However, the second era, this is where we suspect the pyramid builders really came from. And we think of the original pyramids, or the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. They were simply smaller satellite pyramids. We have evidence of much larger pyramids that are built across the land. And in my theories on this channel, I believe that this came from a second era, or a civilization that was still in a golden age, but in a different portion of a golden age. They constructed pyramids because it was a geometrically sound structure, and it also showed their connection to the land. And we don't fully understand what kind of technology that was available both in the construction of these pyramids, and then how they factored into the overall society and the use of such technology. But we suspect that these buildings also developed the internal human being. They supported the spiritual health of the person and not just provided a structure for societal use. It's a very interesting balance to think of. A building that serves society, but at the same time serves the individual. It seems as though our modern buildings oftentimes deprive us of our spiritual health, and they're very, how shall we say, not even remotely aesthetically pleasing. They're just there to be there and serve a function. The third era, which is another era in the last era of the Golden Age, that followed the pyramid builders. And this was an era where we believe that the civilization advanced to building the great star forts, where they could manipulate the land and the structures and integrate them accordingly. No one really knows what heights this civilization reached, but we can speculate that they had tremendous capabilities to build towers to the very sky. They also had the ability to form and shape the land in geometrical configurations that endure to this day. We can see the remnants of this civilization everywhere we look across the lands. There are star forts everywhere. There are also star forts that are integrated in the very land. We also have the theories about how the land is shaped in many places, where we see large sandbars that extend for many miles on the coasts in many lands across the realm. Now we look at our current era, the fifth era, the plastic age, and we see that none of what it is really compares to what we had in the past. We have tall towers of glass and steel, yet they give the impression of being very cheap and disposable. They also show us the fact that our civilization just seems to be something that's readily thrown away and can be thrown away. We also have to remember that we have many, many images of destruction from films, television shows. But today we're going to look specifically at the fourth era, the Tartarian civilization, or the civilization that preceded ours. We want to get an idea of what heights they reached, what was the maximum extent of their capabilities. Because this is the civilization that we see the most defined and detailed remnants of, such as the Iowa State Capitol, the many other beautiful state capitol buildings, the Art Deco buildings, all these buildings that we look at and all these city explorations that we do, they reflect the remnants of the fourth era. Now, let's look at the Tartarian fourth era civilization. And remember, Tartaria is just a term that I assigned to it. The civilization could have been called something completely different. Here's a possible timeline. Break it down into 3 eras, if you will, or 3 portions, 3 phases. An inception and a rising phase, an ascendancy in the height of their civilization, and then a decline and a fall. How long were each of these phases of this Tartarian civilization? We just don't know. They could be 1,000 years. They could be 100 years. We seem to have a great obsession with 1,000 years, and it's probably because it's a nice round number. What did this really look like, though? The main component of this theory is we have to consider the society that existed in this worldwide civilization, their culture, their values, their capabilities, and then ultimately their vulnerabilities. How was it they fell? When they rose, it was clear that they had remnants of the previous era, the third era. But we suspect that the third era endured a great reset or some sort of cataclysm. Looking at what this civilization looked like during its height, we have to think on the integration potentially of pyramid buildings, great towers and domes that reach to the very sky. They had energy capabilities and the ability to generate imagery or energy, both from the atmosphere, and then we've also speculated that they had some sort of crystal power source. They may have had many other sources of energy that they were able to draw from, because it's energy that allowed them to build a great society and civilization. Yet at the same time, we speculate that they had a balance that they achieved between the society and the individual. Harvesting this energy may have well reflected that balance in the fact that they were able to understand the energy that they could harvest from both the land and the very air in the atmosphere, and at the same time the energy that existed beneath the land. It seems as though this gave them the capability, along with their developed cultural and societal understanding, to achieve great constructions beyond our wildest dreams. We only see the bare bones remnants of many of these wonderful structures. Think on the fact that we have diagrams and sketches that show us these incredible buildings at their very height. Yet we take this to even what many would consider a science fiction imaging or imagery of what the society may have looked like at their very height. They had airships, they had vast tall buildings across the land. They had cities that stretched for many, many miles, much larger than the cities that we see today. And their structures were built to be enduring, to last. And of course, you'll ask, well, exactly how did such a large signature of such a civilization fall? Why is it not with us? We don't understand the capabilities that were used to destroy it. We suspect that there was some sort of force or threat that arose in the land that either defeated the civilization internally or externally. A lot of the hints that we have, though, indicate that it was defeated internally. Initially in the conflict, the civilization won in an external conflict. Now, what do we mean by an internal conflict? This adversary found some sort of way to infiltrate the very beings of people and turn them against the civilization. We look at the great beauty at the very height, imagining a civilization that was in total balance. And it's not just the balance between society and the individual, it's also the understanding of the many cultural groups that no doubt existed in this civilization. They were able to exist in a harmonious nature. And we might reflect on the fact that it seems as though everything in our current civilization operates to turn us against each other through any visual difference or any sort of difference, be it a perceived economic, political, or whatever, to keep us at each other's throats. We look at some of the other possibilities of the previous civilization. Great airships with no limits in their traveling capacity. Great airships that could travel the land very quickly and efficiently. There's been a lot of speculation about airplanes recently, and perhaps the reality behind airplanes and jets is that they use some remnant of this technology, and that's why they appear to take off and land so slowly, almost as though they're hovering in a way and they don't operate in the manner that we're told. Yet we look at these great images of these airships and their vast hangars, and again we still see the remnants of this technology scattered across the land. This is what will be shown airship hangars looked like in the 1920s. The fact being, though, is that this did really exist. It causes us to question if the capacity behind this, though, is far greater than we're shown. That this is merely the bare bones remnants of it, the only portions of the technology that they could return to operational capacity. It's interesting to me that we even have accounts that question the existence and the veracity of these airships docking with tall buildings and tall structures. Some cities, such as Tulsa, even completely deny the account that an airship ever docked with any tall structure in the city. Yet there are other accounts within the history of aviation that shows that this is very true, and this was far more commonplace than they'd like us to think now. We consider the fact that there's been a very defined attack on airships. Now we visualize the decline of this previous civilization. If we suspect that they won a physical external war against some unknown enemy, we have to realize that the unknown enemy changed its tactics and infiltrated the civilization itself by corrupting human beings from the inside. As a result, they began to corrupt the very facets that kept the civilization propped up, considering the fact that the civilization was based on an effective government that actually worked in the interests of the people. That was probably one of the first things that changed. The government then became self-serving, or serving the purposes and intentions of the exterior force that infiltrated it. Therefore, they began to turn the civilization against one another, emphasizing every single physical, social, and economic difference, whether they were real or not. Even the perceived differences, the ideals, caused these people to begin to distrust one another, and gradually their civilization began to erode from the inside out. The great buildings were no longer maintained, the energy systems were neglected. People began to even question their once great purpose in life, and achieving the very pinnacle of human being. They began to turn away from that. And you can find evidence in that in every single account from every civilization and culture that exists on the land today, that people were corrupted. Eventually, it became a point to where this civilization could no longer defend itself from an external threat, and either using some natural cataclysm, or perhaps an unnatural cataclysm, an artificial attack using weapons beyond our greatest imagination, they were able to destroy and wreck many of the greatest structures of the civilization that preceded ours. And we have numerous stories of destruction of great edifices in the past, wondrous cities that were reduced to nothing, melted to ash and rubble, and we really don't see any remnants of it today. We think that perhaps the great fires that we read about that seem to dot every single city in the 19th century may have been the finalized destruction of the great structures that remained. We also consider the fact that we have many tales from both biblical and mainstream accounts of vast destruction in the past, even as recently as the 20th century, considering the Tunguska event in Siberia, and even the destruction of the Bronx, which occurred supposedly as late as the 1970s and the early 1980s. Yet the concept of fire from the sky is something that we have to take a lot more seriously. There had to be some great force that was employed, and that's how many of the greatest structures that once existed were utterly annihilated. And here's an image of what remains of the Castle Rock ruins, as I called it, in Wisconsin. Yet you can see it's the remnants of once great buildings. Now I suspect that this is from an earlier era, but this could be as recently as the last era, the fourth era, or the Tartarian civilization. We just don't know. So we have to operate on speculation and try to put the pieces together to put together the overall story of what really happened. And why do I suspect that these ruins are much older and are actually the ruins of these great buildings? Well, it's because of the fact that you can't really get an idea of the structures, but you still see signs of symmetry in these ruins. And these signs of symmetry and the vast magnitude that they reflected had to be the once great structures of the first era. The structures that reached to the very clouds, the legends that we have of such edifices as the Tower of Babel. Yet there are many other accounts that indicate that there were once very large structures that existed, again through societies and cultures across the land, and we'll be told it was merely the work of the gods. This is a idealized depiction of the Golden Age from the Greek account of the Golden Age. And they have a different breakdown of the 5 eras, or the 5 portions of civilization. The Golden Age, the human beings lived amongst the gods, they lived for hundreds of years, and their spirits endured even after they died. They never grew old. Now, is that a reality, or is that just something that we're told to convince us to believe in it? It's ultimately up for you to decide. Of course, now we'll be told that a golden age can be reached again with our technology, and we've always been promised this great future. Although as time passes, we see that no great future is ever delivered to us. We can see that our society continues to grow more disposable. It continues to be something that just feels as though that the quality of service and the quality of life is decreasing. Of course, you'll be told that you're wrong and the quality of life is increasing. However, anybody who has any self-awareness and is capable of thinking for themselves can see that the quality of life is declining. It's not the Garden of Eden. It's not this idealized existence. That just seems to be a false promise that we're given in our current state of being. Did it exist in the past? Well, it must have, because we have accounts of it. And we are constantly detracted or deterred from even trying to visualize this. And we are not encouraged to think that this existed in the past. As though someone doesn't want us to even be able to visualize how great society can be. We have numerous depictions and allusions to things such as a fountain of youth. And why is that so alluring to us? Why is it we fear aging and death so much? Even in the Golden Age, death was a part of life. Apparently aging was not, according to the accounts that we have. Now, whether they're true or not is irrelevant. We still have this perception that the fear of life comes from the ultimate fear of death and the fear of aging. And you can see many examples of how both these fears are used time and time again. We also have accounts of great civilizations that may or may not have existed, such as the legendary kingdom of Prester John. We're told that this was merely a myth that motivated European explorers to go across the land and try to attempt to locate what they believed was an ally to Christendom in the distant past. Yet, looking at some of the accounts of Prester John, it almost feels as though we're given accounts of a remnant or an enclave, an organized enclave of the Tartarian civilization or the Fourth Era that somehow survived the reset and continued to exist and may have existed much closer to the contemporary era than we like to think. Naturally, it was targeted and destroyed over time, and perhaps these are what the great campaigns or the massive reset war that we speculated occurred in the 19th century may have been all about destroying. These enclaves that existed across the land, and perhaps the enclave of Prester John, or whatever the real name was of the individual or society that existed there. Yet looking around, we still see many of the bare bones remnants of the previous civilization, and it's everywhere. Such as here in New Orleans, where you'll see a lot of accounts and a lot of images that show that great advanced buildings existed there. Defenders of the mainstream account will tell us, well, it was simply part of the great French presence that existed in North America and that they forfeited it when they sold it as part of the Louisiana Purchase because of the Napoleonic Wars, which are a very questionable event in and of themselves. Yet we see many of these buildings, and while they may be smaller in scale, we suspect that these buildings are the remnants of the previous civilization, that they reflected their greatness. Now, this is a building that supposedly preceded the Art Deco era in Cleveland, and yet we see such beauty and amazing architectural achievement with it, with the pediment and the columns, and even the height and the beauty and the artistic desire of it. Perhaps this was just a small administrative building that existed in the previous civilization. Or the Marble Room, going back to Cleveland. A beautiful, amazing place to dine, which, again, displays the connection between a society and an individual. A place where you can go and interact with other individuals and at the same time feel your internal being strengthened just by being present in this room. And during the exploration of this particular room, I joked that even a McDonald's hamburger would taste like fine dining if you had this kind of atmosphere and environment that you're eating it in. We also see the remaining state capitals, and we have no doubt that these are clearly the remaining buildings of the previous civilization. Perhaps they were low-level administration buildings, or they were regional administration buildings that survived whatever targeted effects of the last reset occurred, whether that was some sort of artificial weapon, a directed energy weapon, or some other power means that we don't understand. Perhaps the very technology of the previous civilization was subverted and used against it, which we speculated was cymatics. We see images of the current age, also called the Iron Age, or what we call the Plastic Age, which states that people are born with gray hair, that people age rapidly, and they live a very harsh lifestyle, and that the only people who aspire to greatness are the people who are the most proficient at lying. And we see a lot of truth in this. We see a lot of truth in this in our contemporary society, and also in the accounts that we have of the past, where a society or a civilization is subverted by its own ruthless desires. We also think of all the images that we have of utterly destroyed cities, which again reinforces the notion that the previous civilization was completely annihilated, that many of their great buildings were destroyed, and only certain buildings managed to survive this reset. Of course, this is from St. Louis, and we have a mainstream account that's utterly silly in my mind that a steamboat or a paddle steamer started this fire because it crashed into other boats on the river, and then it crashed into buildings somehow and started a great conflagration. We also have the Chicago fire, and we see immense images of apocalyptic destruction from the Chicago fire. Somehow the city was quickly built in a short period of time. The Chicago fire occurred in the 1870s, and then they quickly rebuilt it, to the point to where they were ready to have the greatest World's Fair of all time in the 1890s. Now, if you want to believe this mainstream account, that's entirely up to you, and maybe you think this is credible. Maybe you think these kind of amazing feats in logistics are possible because people worked hard, and if they didn't work hard, they starved and they died. Yet, I find this account very hard to believe, and I find it much more likely that these are images of the last phases of destruction of the previous civilization, where they were targeting any buildings that would be too difficult to explain, or buildings that they could not convincingly repurpose and put in a presupposed narrative. Now, yes, we say narrative, and that term gets a lot of derisive attitude towards it, and rightfully so. However, it is a narrative. It is an account that we're supposed to believe. And the whole point behind it is to cause us to not have any understanding of our true history. Because if we don't know our true history, then we don't know our true identity. Our identity can be shaped to whatever power that truly rules the land wants our identity to be. We're simply nothing. We're creatures who have no greater spiritual health or existence, and we exist for their very pleasure, to be used and discarded as soon as we're done. And they'll openly admit this too in mainstream accounts. Yet we look back to the Golden Age, and we realize that there was something much greater. There are accounts that our civilization and our people and our identity was much greater in the distant past. That's the real purpose behind these explorations. It's a journey inward to rediscover the strength that lies within every human being. That's why my approach is not to tell you what to think. You have to decide for yourself what to think. You have to decide for yourself what to believe, who to listen to, and what's really true and real and what's not. And I'm not ever going to insult anyone by insulting what they believe, and if you believe the mainstream account is correct, well then go ahead. It's not going to bother me whatsoever. However, going back to the previous age, There's no doubt that it seemed to be a return to the glories of the distant past. At its very height, the Tartarian age did reach that, with a balance between society and the individual, with a true cultural understanding. Perhaps the story of the Tower of Babel is not so distant or legendary as we like to think. Perhaps it's not reflecting the differences in languages, but simply reflecting the differences in civilizations and cultures, as they've now been inherently divided and are encouraged to be divided by the current ruling powers of the lands. Because it's a lot easier to retain control when you keep people divided. You keep them unaware of what their past is. They live in a state of amnesia, or much worse, they live with a fabricated past. Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. The secret of steel always carried with it a mystery. You must learn its riddle, Conan. You must learn its discipline. If I die, I have to go before him, and he will ask me, "What is the riddle of steel?" If I don't know it, he will cast me out of Valhalla and laugh at me.
You were sleeping. You slept too long. We all have. It's time we woke. Time we stopped running.
Welcome to the Restitute Orbis channel, and today we're exploring Conan's old world, Hyperborea. The interesting aspect of sword and sorcery literature, and we're told that the Conan stories written by author Robert E. Howard was the father of sword and sorcery tales. How does it relate to high fantasy, though, and how does Robert E. Howard's world that he devised in the 1930s fit into our Five Eras timeline? Maybe it doesn't fit into our Five Eras timeline, but could it be an early portion of what we consider the Fourth Era or the Tartarian era? Or could it be that these stories took place during the Second or Third Eras, and that they recount tales and stories and civilizations from those time frames? We're going to explore that today. We're also going to consider the fact that maybe these are all just fictional stories that someone who only lived for 30 years improvised from their wondrous creativity and imagination. We start by considering the account of Robert E. Howard, the author himself, and the Hyborian Age. Now, the Hyborian Age is what Robert E. Howard, the author, referred to as the time that his main character, Conan the Barbarian, lived in. The Hyborian Age is a contraction of the land Hyperborea, which was a legendary land that the Greeks had thought existed in the north, or what we think of as the Arctic Circle today. Oddly enough, these are the same Greeks that we attribute the foundation of civilization to, and yet we also say that they were superstitious fools who didn't exactly know the layout of their own land. Once again, another conflicted account, this time with what we consider to be the foundation of our current civilization, at least in the mainstream. Looking at the land that Howard improvised or innovated, if you go off of the mainstream account, you can see that there are many parallels with our current land, and yet it looks very different. We consider the fact that the nature of the land may have changed through reset after reset. But who exactly was Robert E. Howard, and what was unique about him as an author? Robert E. Howard was born and lived in Texas his entire life. He only lived for 30 years, 1906 to 1936, during a questionable time, the Roaring Twenties, and of course the Great Depression, which we've looked at many times. Robert E. Howard was a self-taught author. He was someone who taught himself the art of writing. And he had a very difficult life from what we understand. At least he was self-conflicted as an individual. Again, this is the mainstream account. We, oddly enough, know little about him as a person aside from what's written about him. And yet, in the 1930s, he was the one who innovated these fantasy tales, this sword and sorcery genre. Indeed, he's considered the father of sword and sorcery genre, even though he only lived to be 30 years old, and he only had one novel about the Conan stories. Predominantly, the Conan stories and the Hyborian essay that he wrote were simply to appear in many periodicals as short stories. The other interesting thing about Robert E. Howard is the fact that he only did live 30 years, and yet he had this creativity and imagination to innovate this entire world from his mind. He was also a correspondent with H.P. Lovecraft and seemed to share many of the aspects of other realms and the concept of portals and greater powers influencing the world or the land. Yet at the same time, he also disputed H.P. Lovecraft's view of civilization. Howard believed that civilization represented a threat to the individual, whereas Lovecraft was a proponent of civilization. Again, that's what the mainstream tells us. Who knows what the reality is? What was truly interesting, though, about Howard's stories at the time was that they touched on an entirely new genre that supposedly hadn't been revealed to the public before in fiction. Also recall that when most of these Conan stories were originally published as short stories, it was during the time of the Great Depression, and we're also told that Howard was afflicted by the Great Depression. In Howard's fictional narrative, he actually started with stories of Kull the King, which talked about the Thurian continent, or the Thurian Age. This was the time frame that preceded the Hyborian Age, and oddly enough, it refers to Thul, it refers to Atlantis, and Lemuria. Indeed, Howard seemed to recognize that these were civilizations during this particular age. And then there was a great cataclysm, and then this entire civilization was destroyed. And so you can already see that we have many of the allusions to the things that we explore in our Five Eras theory and looking at the old world. Now, once again, this could have just all been the fictional mindset of an inspired author in the 1930s in Texas. And you can look and see some of the examples from the Thurian Age, or the age of King Kull. King Kull himself was from Atlantis. And it's odd to consider that Howard was referring to a time when Atlantis existed. Indeed, he states that when the Hyborian Age occurred, it was between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, or what we consider to be the more quote-unquote modern civilizations, Sumer and Babylon. We'll also be exploring them here in the near future. It's intriguing, though, that what Howard's view of this point is that this particular series of civilizations had magic and had many other intricacies involved in its civilization. And recall that we're told that Howard considered civilization evil, although if you go off of mainstream history, one could understand why we would have that perception. Although we don't really know much about Howard directly. We know that the Thurian Age was succeeded by the Hyborian Age, and this was the age in which Conan the Barbarian, the eponymous character of Howard's most well-known stories, and the very well-known movie that was made in the early 1980s, launching the acting career of Arnold Schwarzenegger. What makes Conan special, and what makes the Hyborian Age that Robert E. Howard wrote about unique? It improvised, in many ways, story elements that were told were not in existence at that time. It also incited the start of the sword and sorcery genre. Now you're probably asking, what's the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy, or what we think of with the Lord of the Rings series, which we explored in the works of Tolkien last year on this channel? Sword and sorcery allegedly just involve stories that are simply a single individual struggling in the same sort of environment that you tend to see in high fantasy, whereas high fantasy stories, primarily written by Tolkien, involve the entire fate of the world. At least that's the simple way to understand the differences between high fantasy and sword and sorcery, yet they involve many of the same elements. Of course, there's also the perception that sword and sorcery tends to reflect a much more violent and individualistic nature, which supposedly goes along with the values that Robert E. Howard embraced. The other interesting thing looking at Hyboria, though, is supposedly Howard was inspired by the existence of nations, and certain kingdoms within Hyboria, or the Hyborian Age that existed, Aquilonia and several others, are allegedly inspired by real-life kingdoms, or real-life city-states in Italy even, such as Aquilonia. However, in the film, we also see a wonderful depiction and an interpretation of what Howard may have imagined. We also have to remember that most of the works of Conan were written by other authors over time. Since Howard passed away, he committed suicide in 1936. We're told that he had a difficult life, and there are many different theories in terms of his internal struggles and conflicts. We just don't know exactly what was going on. It is rather interesting, though, that an individual who only lived to be 30 years managed to completely create this entire world, just with their creativity and imagination. Now, I'm not questioning if Howard did this. It's another interesting consideration, much in the same way as J.R.R. Tolkien, or even more contemporaneously, George R.R. Martin. These entire worlds that are created that give us a reflection of a very distant past time, and yet they show reset events. Consider the character of Conan himself. Conan represents the barbarian. It's in the title, Conan the Barbarian. He represents the ultimate individual from Howard's perception. The person who actually reflects qualities and values that are, according to Howard in the stories, superior to the individuals that live in civilizations. Yet, really, when it comes down to this superiority, it's not so much in one person being seen as better than the other. It's the fact that Conan embraces certain values that tend to be lost in civilizations. So perhaps Howard was simply given a warning in his character of Conan. You see no shortage of exotic creatures in elaborate accounts, such as snakes that are 80 feet long. And to this day, we have several accounts of alleged cryptid sightings of gigantic snakes in distant areas across the land. Maybe they exist, maybe they do not. Or maybe they existed in the past. Our mainstream says that giant snakes existed in the past. Of course, it's in the very distant past, as it always is. A lot of the landscapes and civilizations, and indeed the existential threat that was facing Hyperborea, was indeed reflected by the presence of snakes, or the worship of the snake god Set. And we'll discuss that when we look into the civilization of Stygia in Hyboria. Oddly enough, there is also numerous references to the power of a new form of religion and influence, which indeed was the worship of Set, which is very well reflected in the early 1980s movie, when we see not just the worship of snakes, but also the concept of embracing an identity of void. And indeed, the individual who is responsible for this, the character Thulsa Doom, embraces a twisted misanthropy in the film. We also see how Conan acquires his great sword, an Atlantean sword, when he falls into an old Atlantean tomb. And we see that the Atlantean king, or general, or whatever you want to think of him as, is a giant individual. Now again, this is just reflected in the story, but there's also a lot of symbolism. Indeed, what made the original Conan the Barbarian so successful as a film was that it relied a lot more on symbolism, on music, and on telling a story through visual elements instead of dialogue. Conan doesn't really speak a lot of dialogue, and indeed this happened to cater to the strengths of Arnold Schwarzenegger's ability to convey a physical performance. And not to denigrate Arnold Schwarzenegger's acting capability, but you're simply catering to an individual's strengths, and it's one of the reasons why the film worked so incredibly well. It also had a wondrous theme concerning the riddle of steel. What was the real search behind it? And the film doesn't tell you what the answer to the riddle of steel is, but it does display it very clearly in the entire plot. The other threats that Conan faces do tend to be the corruption of civilization, and that's depicted both in the original stories and in the way that it's depicted in the film. Now, there's numerous changes made to Howard's original characters, and of course, if you go to the city in Italy to this day that Aquilonia was inspired by, one of the kingdoms in Hyboria, you'll see that they have a nice collection of bells there. And that's just another little odd coincidence that we have when we consider the power of bells and what they could be representing in our many previous civilizations. There's also statements that Howard was inspired by individuals such as the Picts and other tribes that supposedly existed in history, but strangely enough, we have conflicting accounts about them as well, in terms of how civilized they were, how advanced they were, and it tends to create many different conflicting accounts. Officially, we're told that the reason Howard did not want to utilize actual history was it would have been too difficult to do the research to incorporate it into his stories at the time. Yet, he didn't have a Carnegie Library nearby in Texas, and of course we're well aware of many libraries at that time. We're also told that he innovated these great kingdoms and these lands in this time of Hyboria. But what would have been easier? Would it have been easier simply to go off of what was already written, or to innovate it? Or is it possible that he was actually consulting a different historical account, an alternate series of events? We even have accounts of apes that evolved into men that evolved further beyond that, and within a very compressed time period. A lot of people will find that there was a lot of controversy in Howard's works at the time, although the concept of controversy evaluating Howard's work seems to ebb and flow depending on the current state of events, which we can really say about anything. We certainly love to discuss how everything's controversial here in the 2000s. But you also see the other element of the Hyborian age with the constant conflicts and civilizations that are rising and falling, and that's something else that Howard tended to emphasize in his works, and indeed in some of the letters that we have in his exchanges with H.P. Lovecraft, he argued for the fact that there never really was one dominant civilization. Civilizations would rise, civilizations would fall. There was never really one that would ultimately hold the keys towards eternal existence. And yet Howard believed that the real strength, the real enduring quality of human beings was actually in the strength of the individual. And that explains a lot of his viewpoints and what we see in the stories. Now let's look at Stygia and Thulsa Doom. Stygia was considered a corrupted nation, a corrupted land that worshipped the snake god Set. There's a lot of interesting elements when you consider Stygia, especially given their entire culture and society. The high priests of Set within Stygia held all the influence. Now, supposedly Stygia was inspired by many different civilizations that are actually written about in history, and indeed we have no shortage of supposed honest historical accounts that talk about the primacy of sacrifice and how that would contribute to a civilization in the past. We certainly enjoy attributing that to the Aztecs, and it's one of the darker aspects of that civilization, if it did in fact occurred. Yet, oddly enough, when you step far enough back, you can find many examples of sacrifice, conducted in many different formats. Of course, the justification for sacrifice changes. In the past, we're told that sacrifice was done by a superstitious people, so it would preclude the natural events of the world overcoming them. And yet one of the darker elements of Stygia is the fact that they took sacrifice as an essential element of their society. There's no shortage of depictions, innovations, and creative artistic renderings that show how these sacrifices that were dedicated to the snake god of Set were conducted in Stygia. And indeed, the priests of Stygia and what they proposed for maintaining their civilization in balance with nature is a very alarming and disturbing story to look at. There is also the entire presence of snakes. Now, recall that earlier in explorations on this channel, we don't want to condemn simply the presence of snakes, but it comes down to how the symbolism is used and employed when we look at Stygia. It's also stepping back and looking at this kingdom, this civilization that supposedly came from the mind of Robert E. Howard, and yet there's some other disturbing elements that seem to bear some sort of realism in it. There's even the account of the snake god Set himself, or itself. The fact that it exists in multiple dimensions, that it can travel through portals, that it has all sorts of power. The power to deceive, the power to transform, the power to assume multiple forms, the power to create and destroy. We're even told that between the Thurian and the Hyborian age, or if you want to see as a reset being between those, Set was always one of the main individuals, the main deities that opposed the progress of humanity. And normally this was done in the stories through the advent of a corrupted civilization, which was represented by Stygia. In the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian, we see that the main character Thulsa Doom, who was also an antagonist from the original stories, albeit in a very different incarnation, embraced the concept of the worship of Set. And this is the commonality that you see. The character is wonderfully portrayed by James Earl Jones in the 1982 film. And his Thulsa Doom is of an ancient race that's been nearly extinct. The dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa Doom is over 1,000 years old. And he's recruited several priests who have wondrous warrior capabilities, and here you see the High Priest Rexer on the right, and his assistant Thorgrim. These are the individuals in the film that carry out the will of Thulsa Doom. And indeed we see Rexor pictured here, who is no doubt Thulsa Doom's chosen successor. They recruit a group of followers, which quickly grows into the thousands and tens of thousands, and the dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa Doom's snake cult is spreading across the entire world. Every single city has built a tower dedicated to the worship of Set. The people seem to be aware that this is an evil, terrifying threat, and yet no one really seems to have the will to do much of anything about it. Aside from King Osric, whose daughter is recruited by Thulsa Doom to be at his side. And indeed, the main plot element involves King Osric recruiting Conan, Valeria, and Subutai, his companions, to rescue his daughter from the clutches of Thulsa Doom. Thulsa Doom is portrayed wonderfully by James Earl Jones in the fact that he has an understanding of what the Riddle of Steel is really about. He also has tremendous charisma and influence over his followers. The fact that Thulsa Doom can speak with a voice and character inflections such as James Earl Jones, you can see that there's a lot of sense to many of the things that he's stating. When he talks about some of the unfortunate traits of individuals to be easily corrupted. He also shows and displays the power of influence that he has over his followers, when he asks one of his followers to simply come to him and jump off a cliff to her very untimely demise. And one of the points that he makes is the fact that he has this kind of influence, that this is true power. And many people simply give up their own will, or don't practice their own will, and succumb to the nature of Thulsa Doom. And here you see a very adequate depiction of what was represented by Stygia and this worship of the cult of Set. There is even the fact that Thulsa Doom himself can transform into a large snake, and it's depicted quite directly in the film, where we see Thulsa Doom transform into a snake, and it gives us a showcase of his magical capability, and indeed the unique aspects of the species that he was originally a member of. I like the fact, though, that the film gives you clues about it. It shows you his capability, but it doesn't have to explain the origin in detail, because oftentimes we do have mystery in life. And it doesn't affect the plot of the film, and it doesn't affect what's displayed with solving the Riddle of Steel, but it does give you some clues in terms of how powerful and charismatic certain individuals can be. And we all have to decide if a charismatic individual is really acting on our behalf or not. And you can see here the original depiction of Thulsa Doom as Robert E. Howard allegedly innovated the character. I don't believe that it betrays the actual vision, though, of Robert E. Howard, as the film did combine many of the elements that he had in his original stories, and it did represent many of the themes that he wanted to convey. Indeed, we have to consider the Riddle of Steel to understand the fundamental values. And what is the answer to the Riddle of Steel? Shall I tell you? It's the least I can do. Throughout the film, it begins with a monologue between Conan and his father. And that was one of the quotes at the start of this exploration, where Conan's father explains that he has to solve the Riddle of Steel. And indeed, the entire film revolves around events of Conan's life. A lot of people think that the original Conan the Barbarian is simply a revenge story. Conan's going to seek Thulsa Doom because Thulsa Doom raided Conan's village to kill Conan's people, his mother, his father, and then steal his father's sword, because as Thulsa Doom said later, he believed that weapons of steel were the key to success. And indeed, we see the terrifying scene where Conan has to witness the slaughter of his mother and his father right in front of his eyes. That's the opening event of his life that occurs shortly after his father tells him about the Riddle of Steel. So, the entire film is about the events of Conan's life. And really it's about Conan going through events and experiencing things and trying to solve the Riddle of Steel. And as he relays to Subutai, his companion who's a thief later in the film once he grows up, he says that he has to solve the Riddle of Steel. But what is the answer to the Riddle of Steel? Many people have said that it's simply an expression of will. It's that simple. And indeed, we see Conan's will tested when he's captured after his village is destroyed, and he's chained to the Wheel of Pain, which he pushes for years. We're given the impression that the other survivors from the raid died over time, but only Conan survived, and he achieved a body of great strength and capability just by surviving and pushing the wheel. Conan is recruited to be a pit fighter, and he is involved in many pit fights in which he has no choice but to kill his opponent every time. And so we see that the initial events of Conan's life have been tragedy. He's forced into situations of terrifying violence, witnessing the death of his parents, and then having to kill himself in order to survive. However, as a result of his victories, he's given an education, and he's brought to a higher status. Indeed, he's able to develop himself as an individual, even with the constraints of his particular situation. And soon he earns his freedom, freed by the very individual who had employed him in pit fighting, and he goes off on his own to seek vengeance against Thulsa Doom. Eventually he finds Thulsa Doom, the individual who led the raid of his village, who tells him that flesh is stronger than steel, that he will tell him the answer to the Riddle of Steel. And indeed, that's exactly how Thulsa Doom depicts it, that flesh is stronger. And he makes a very direct allusion to where the real power is, what is steel compared to the hand that wields it, and shows Conan that his influence and power over his followers is infinitely more powerful than the material of steel. He has Conan crucified, and Conan nearly dies until he's rescued by his companions. And it's at this point that Conan begins to reflect inwardly. He's learned through his life and his experiences, and he understands that what he really has to achieve is self-awareness. And when we see the kata after Conan survives his crucifixion, we understand that he's achieved self-awareness. In his final battle against Rexor, Thulsa high priest, Conan frees himself by breaking his father's sword in combat. This is symbolic. It represents Conan breaking the chains of his past and achieving his self-awareness, and ultimately his self-agency. While he's broken his father's sword, he still shows tribute to his past. He still understands his connections, but now he's no longer bound by it. He has the ability to impose his own purpose, his own values in life. And it's represented during the time when he wins this duel and wins back his father's sword, which he uses to confront Thulsa and ultimately kill Thulsa. Now, it may seem like it's a vengeance story, but behind it, under the surface, we see that Conan has sorted out the riddle of steel. And the answer to the riddle of steel is that self-agency is what everything is about. Achieving self-awareness through your experiences, that gives you the ability to impose will. That is the answer to the riddle of steel. So what era was the Hyborian Age and the Thurian Age, or whatever you want to call these time frames? Remember that the Thurian Age came first. Did it actually happen in the second era, and that's when we had the Thurian Age? Or did the Thurian Age come in the third era? We could see that in any point where we want to see Atlantis and Lemuria actually happening. There's indications for both. Or what about Hyboria? Did the Hyborian Age occur in the third era, or did it occur in the fourth era? Or is it possible that these were all just from the imagination of Robert E. Howard, and that this is all just a fiction? I do consider that possibility. There's also another perception that perhaps both these ages occurred in a single area, the Thurian Age and the Hyborian Age in the second or the third era. Because remember, we don't exactly have a hard and fast line defining between resets. Or maybe they occurred in the fourth era, at the start before the Tartarian civilization. It's an interesting look to see how different people have viewed the past. And it is possible that Robert E. Howard may have had some access, or may simply be another, how shall we say, placeholder individual that released a lot of this information, some sort of disclosure. It could also be possible that this is also similar to what we see released through the works of George R.R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien. We just don't know. And yet, when we see these allusions to past and previous civilizations, we realize that there could be much more to this in terms of fact and in terms of historiosity. It is rather strange that Robert E. Howard managed to compose an entire Hyborian essay in which he outlined this entire world that he supposedly just envisioned in his mind. Now, I don't want to discredit a single individual's creativity and imagination, but remember that Robert E. Howard lived a very difficult life, and he only lived for 30 years. And yet he was able to innovate something, an entire world all of his own, which other authors and other creators were able to run with for decades, and even continuing to this day. So what do you think? Is it possible that this Hyborian Age really occurred in history, or is it all just from the imagination of one individual? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. St. Louis, a beautiful city on the Mississippi, in the Mississippi River Valley. Why do we call this an old world capital? Well, even the mainstream admits that there was something here, and there's been something here for many hundreds of years, or perhaps more. Of course, we have no idea. And the mainstream calls it the Cahokia culture, supposedly a group of Native Americans that lived on the east side of the Mississippi River, and once had a great and flourishing civilization, and now we call them mound builders. Frequent viewers of this channel might remember an early exploration that was done in Wisconsin near the town of Lake Mills, where we discuss some mounds there and how they were called mounds, although they were very clearly pyramids, but we don't call them pyramids. We have the typical founding story with St. Louis, and St. Louis was founded on February 14th, 1764 by some French fur traders. 3 individuals, isn't it funny how it's always 3 or 4? And from that time on, the area and the city and the settlement slowly grew. We have the Lewis and Clark expedition going through there. We have the fact that it was part of the Louisiana Purchase and that it was sold to the United States. And then because of its central position on the river, it developed into an incredible city. And yet when we look into the detail of this city, we see a plethora of incredible structures and a very rich history that once again defy simple explanation. The purpose of today's exploration is to look at some of the most profound of these structures and pose the typical questions that we have on this channel about their origin, and does it truly point to an old world civilization, or are these structures that our current civilization did? And of course, St. Louis has so many different aspects and so many of these structures, there's no way we're going to be able to cover them on one video. So these are just the initial structures that we're going to take a look at. No doubt the channel will be returning to St. Louis to explore other aspects of it, as there's no way we could cover it in a single video. So let's begin. We start with looking at Eads Bridge, which fortuitously was completed in construction in 1874, the same year as this rendering or this aerial drawing or whatever you want to call it was completed. The other interesting thing about St. Louis is just how well built out it is in 1874. Here's a picture of one of the mounds, or the remnants of it, and who knows what this structure really was. We'll be told that this was something from some pre-existing Native American civilization that was there, although when you look at it, you have to wonder. We'll do a separate exploration on the mounds because they require that kind of level of detail to theorize and speculate what was really going on in St. Louis. It's an incredible structure in and of itself, and it almost looks like it could be the cornerstone of some much larger structure. And we go to the Cahokia Mound in East St. Louis, or I believe it's Collinsville, the town in Illinois where it's located near. And we recall the exploration that we did to mounds and pyramids in Wisconsin, and here we have the same thing, supposedly from the same civilization. It's a mound. It's not a pyramid. It just looks like a pyramid. You can never get enough of that one. Very beautiful, and it paints the picture that there was definitely a pre-existing civilization in St. Louis. In 1849, St. Louis experienced a fire, because every city experienced some fire at some point. The story of the fire in St. Louis is quite fascinating, though, because it stated that it was started by a paddle steamer, or boat that somehow caught fire, nobody knows how, and it caught other boats on fire, and then somehow those boats caught the buildings on fire, destroying hundreds of buildings. And here is a photo, or an early version of a photo, from 1849, and the destruction that was reaped by that fire. Do you really think that a fire could cause this kind of destruction? Well, maybe you do. And let me know in the comments how and why you think such destruction would be possible. It's also staggering when you look at the type of construction in these buildings in 1849, and then in the distance you see the buildings that seem to survive the fire, or whatever force really caused this destruction. Yes, I question if it was a fire, because that's always the explanation that's given. Just an incredible tower back there, and then you see some of the buildings. 1849 in St. Louis. It's very revealing in and of itself when you look at photos like these with this kind of destruction. Of course, it wasn't just a fire that hit St. Louis, much like Louisville, which shares its namesake as they were both named after King Louis. St. Louis was hit by a tornado, a cyclone, although I think they call it a tornado, in 1896. So we have a fire and a tornado for St. Louis. And of course, this was a very devastating tornado, because what else would it be? And we have numerous photos of the destruction from the 1890s. Look at the road and the rails there. Another recurring theme that we see. What came first? The bricks in the road or the rail? Who really knows? Again, just a staggering amount of destruction, which is always in the origin stories of these cities. This was an intriguing photo because we're given that this photo is from an early period in St. Louis, 1840s, 1850s, and we're told that these individuals are involved in the slave trade at the time. Although it looks like it's just a group of people who are just hanging out, and they could frankly be doing anything, talking about how they're going to set up St. Louis for future generations to consider it. Who knows? In any event, here's another photo from the 1880s, and we see the well-built-out city. We see all the detail in the construction. And here we see it looks like mud is covering the road, but you still have tracks, and there's even a trolley. Can't tell if it's being pulled by a horse or not. Later photo from the 1890s, although to be fair, these photos could be from any time. We don't know for sure, but this is what we're told. And here we see more of the bricks and the tracks. And of course, very well built out already with some taller buildings, multiple stories. That's always the intriguing story about St. Louis, is the fact that there's conflicting accounts. Here we have the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, completed in 1914, another gorgeous Catholic church. We saw many gorgeous churches in Louisville, and now in St. Louis. Funny we don't call it St. Louis, although some people do. We have this same incredible architecture in 1914, and of course with the beautiful window, and as some of my frequent viewers will say, their favorite word with a C. And if you know what that word is, go ahead and type it in the comments. This also gives an idea of life in St. Louis in the 1890s, and it's a different depiction than what we'd expect to see. It looks very luxurious and very comfortable. And little did they know that in 2 years, the city was going to be hit by a very devastating tornado. However, I always find pictures like these showing just the regular life to be interesting as well, because supposedly it gives you some sort of insight to what's really going on and how the people were living their life at the time. Like the gentleman in the front there who's looking back towards the camera. This is the Wainwright Building, an early skyscraper that was built in the 1890s in St. Louis that stands today. Very beautiful building with a lot of ornate and intricate detail on it. And it's incredible that it survives to this day, because usually these are the buildings that would be the first targets of the so-called urban renewal of the 1960s in the United States. So there's our intro to St. Louis. Let's take a look at some fine details and structures. Let's begin with the Old Courthouse in St. Louis. The Old Courthouse. Originally, the land was designated for it in 1816, and then we have one of these recurring stories where they spent years building it, remodeling it, tearing down a wing, rebuilding a wing, and then by 1864, they had finished by establishing an amazing dome that was modeled after the Basilica in St. Peter's in Rome, much as the U.S. Capitol was, and that's how they explain the Capitol Dome looking like the U.S. Capitol Dome. It's a great story. We have to wonder if when they were settling Missouri and St. Louis, if this building was potentially considered to be the state capitol. As wouldn't it make more sense for the state capitol to be in St. Louis? No, go to Jefferson. They've got more steps and more columns on the state capitol building there. Regardless, this courthouse is gorgeous on the inside. You see the columns lining the interior of this quote-unquote courtroom, which could just as easily be any other kind of room if it was properly configured to be, whether it was a state assembly hall or something along those lines. And look at the detail in the ceiling. I'm also amazed by how new and even modern, I dare say, this building looks on the inside. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's known for where they heard the Dred Scott decision, and that was a landmark Supreme Court case that was considered the powder keg for the United States Civil War. Looking at this building, you see a prototype for all U.S. capitals potentially, and yet its ornate detail and beauty matches every single one of them. Yet, this is not a capitol. It's just a courthouse. And then looking on the inside in the dome, and you see the same kind of detail and beauty. You see the pillars with the beautiful ornate detail on them. It defies simple explanation. And we have to wonder what's really going on here when we see a structure like this that's designated a courthouse. And yet it resembles a state capitol and exceeds the modern state capitals of many states. In my humble opinion, of course. But what do you think? The Anheuser-Busch Brewery, considered a brewery complex, opened in 1852. Yes, of course, you need a very large complex with a huge clock tower and large smokestacks and many buildings if you're going to properly brew beer. We don't have much in the history behind how this complex was constructed, and it still stands today in all of its excessive number of buildings, and yet details with these buildings, seeing some of the foundation construction stones. I think they're being the most honest when they tell us that this was opened in 1852. They don't really say anything about construction, and they don't use the typical word of founding. It was just opened, almost as though they found the facility as it was, occupied it, and decided to start brewing beer. They must have been brewing a lot of beer when you see the amount of infrastructure, the detail, and the simple space that goes into this brewery complex. I suppose calling it a brewery complex is again another honest aspect. And here it is today. You can still see this today, and it should be telling the fact that this brewery complex endures to this day, complete with the smokestacks, clock tower, and all the amazing beautiful detail. Do you think we could build a brewery complex like this today? The St. Louis City Hall. They started construction on this in 1890, and they say they finished in 1904, 14 years to build this elaborate beauty. Of course, we'll be told it's some sort of French Renaissance revival style, but I think I'm going to call this one steampunk revival style. What do you think? What would be a good name for a structure like this? Look at the baseline stones and the small columns there towards the bottom. Then you have something different as you go up above the first floor. It's an incredible mixture of different styles, supposedly, although we wonder who really built it. I'm having trouble accepting the narrative on this one. Look at the portal windows there, and then all the elaborate detail along the exterior. Each of the 3 doorways, and it looks to be sectional pillars along each doorway, although who knows for sure. I'm just going off of appearances. It's been a while since I've been to St. Louis, and when I was around the City Hall, I remember just being struck by its beauty. And you even see the clock up there, the detailed ornate clock. The coloring is also interesting with what the construction actually is. We'll be told it's sandstone, limestone, a mix of concrete, and all the other elaborate exotic materials that seem to be available. But then we look in the interior, and we see something just quite otherworldly. Again, this looks like the interior of some sort of building that could be used for a science fiction or a fantasy setting. And I go back to steampunk revival style because I'm thinking of that when I look at the interior of this unbelievable city hall. Now, we've seen the other ones and what makes them unbelievable, but for here it's the styling. And you just have to wonder how exactly they pulled this off from 1890 to 1904, as they told us. Windows, arches, skylights. Similar to what we've seen in other buildings and state capitals, and here it is in the St. Louis City Hall. But I think there's even more detail, if we look harder, that we can see in both the inside and outside of this extraordinary building. And we look on the outside and we see the interesting structure and some of the adornments on the towers that don't really make a lot of sense. And you have to wonder what was the point behind this. And it also makes it difficult to really calculate or estimate what the age could be. There are so many conflicting estimates you can get just by looking at this building. And of course, we're always told they need to clean it, but then you see a contrast here in this black and white photo. And again, we see the scaling with these columns. And we wonder how these were emplaced and what kind of efforts went to achieve this. Whoever originally built this building. I mean, if it was just our contractors and our genius architect in 1890, we have to wonder what challenges they had to overcome. But of course, it's hard to accept the narrative with a building like this when you see this kind of beauty. This is definitely an extraordinary City Hall building that matches what we've seen so far. If not in size, then at least in beauty and artistic, inspirational appeal. Definitely something that's not easily forgotten when it comes to considering the history of St. Louis and the true history of these cities. And now to the Eads Bridge. They started construction on this in 1867 and completed it in 1874. Designed and architected, you know how that goes, by James Buchanan Eads, another inventor, civil engineer extraordinaire from the 19th century. And here we have the drawing or rendering of it, and this connects St. Louis to East St. Louis across the mighty Mississippi River. Incredible that it only took them 7 years to construct this. We have some nice drawings of the construction here on this original drawing that no doubt convinces us and others that would look at this that this bridge really was built as they said that it was within 7 years. The interesting thing about James Buchanan Eads is that he had quite the reputation for being able to conceptualize solutions to very difficult problems. And it didn't matter what kind of engineering problems that they encountered. He seemed to always have a solution. Just like many of these other incredible architects that we encounter when we look at the official historical narrative behind these structures. It's a beautiful bridge, and it clearly took a lot of effort, and it only took them 7 years. But I wonder, do we have any photos? Well, I came across this construction photo, and yet there are certain things within the detail of it that causes questions. For example, we see that the support pylons seem to already be complete, and we have to wonder, are they just reconnecting the support pylons? Or is there something a little bit more off in this particular picture of the construction of the Eads Bridge? Because, of course, we have the typical vanilla skies, and then so much missing detail when we look towards the top of it. What does this really tell us? Or is this not telling us something? What's even more strange is that when you look at the right of the supports, it almost looks as though the stone in construction seems new, but then towards the base, it looks like it's old. So I don't know. What do you think about this photo? Let me know in the comments. And then look at this over here. Some of these stones just look very old. The foundation stones, or that they've been subjected to some kind of force. Was there some other fire? Were there other steamboats just randomly catching on fire in the Mississippi? Should be noted that James Buchanan Eads also constructed and designed the Union River ironclads that were decisive, supposedly, for the Union securing control of the Mississippi River during the Civil War. In the United States Civil War, it stated that in the Western theater, the Union or the North had essentially won the war by 1863. And now on to the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. This has been covered extensively by many explorers over time, and I haven't really touched the World's Fairs in detail yet, but it is worth noting that a very significant World's Fair occurred in St. Louis, and this was considered the next biggest one after Chicago. And we've seen many of these photos before with these beautiful, impressive, and yet temporary buildings. Although what I find fascinating is that the construction cues that we see on them match many of the construction cues that we see on the state capitals. We see the rotunda, the portal windows, the pillars, the columns, and it seems to show itself in a lot of these buildings. What's the true story here? Were these temporary buildings as we're told? Or were these older existing buildings that were simply showcased in an exposition, a World's Fair, and then afterwards they were quickly demolished, along with the story that they were always temporary? I'm not sure. It's interesting, though, how what was original research on the World's Fairs has suddenly become very clouded over the last couple years. We initially just had photos, such as this, that gave us the indication that these were all real structures, and there really wasn't much question about it. And when I say real structures, appearing as though that they were structures that had always been there, and were far older than one would think as temporary structures. Well, it's a question we continue to struggle to answer. Moving on to Union Station in St. Louis. The beautiful, opulent, and very massive Union Station. They tell us they opened this beauty just like the brewery in 1894. No real timeline for construction. Huge building, and we see the amazing clock tower, and after some of the comments, I'm not wondering now if that tower was potentially a docking port for airships, or if that was the intention. Why do you need a clock tower that tall on what's supposed to be a rail station? This was the largest rail station in the world when it was constructed, and you have to really see some of these photos to get an idea for the immense area. And I remember doing a joint exploration with Old World Exploration on this. And even though I'd actually been to this location, I didn't fully appreciate the size and immensity behind it. Just how large the covered area running to the station itself was, where they had the train stage. Also, a little note for film buffs out there, the famous scene in Escape from New York in 1981, where Snake Plissken rescues the president from the train he's being held in, was filmed in this very same location, right here in this covered area where all the trains were staged. And if you watch a more HD version of the film, you can see it very clearly, and it gives you a good idea of the size and immensity of not just this structure, but the sheltered area for all the trains. And we have to wonder, when they say opened, it really just gives the feeling, much like founded, that they just came across the building, occupied it, and then put it back into service. And we do have to wonder if there were other functions for this incredibly large building, especially with the very tall tower and just the amount of space that you have. Although, looking at this entryway and the beauty in the stones and the detail in the arch, I remember seeing this when I was a kid and I was in awe of it, but I didn't understand then exactly what this meant. And when you look at the exterior stones and yet the detail and the precision in how they're cut, it's something that defies simple explanation. And not even saying anything for the sidewalk or the walkway that runs right up to this incredible entrance. And we haven't even talked about the interior yet. And here we have our classic, beautiful interior. Something that exceeds everything that we've seen with Art Deco. And certainly there's nothing modern or contemporary that's been built that matches the interior of this. And this is really where you get an idea of something that's completely and totally otherworldly. Just in case you were feeling a little lonely on water towers, let's look at the Compton Hill Water Tower in St. Louis. A beautiful standpipe water tower, as they called it. This was built in 1898. Apparently it only took them a year. Again, we see this incredible beauty and detail with what looks to be sort of a bell-top construction, and then a couple subsidiary towers, including a subsidiary tower that's actually taller than the main tower, it appears. Very beautiful. One has to wonder why. And here's our construction photo, supposedly, of the standpipe, number 3 as they called it in the photo, although it did become the Compton Hill Water Tower. Yes, isn't that a very beautiful and convincing construction photo? I really like how pristine those blocks look, too. Although, where would one see pristine blocks in the completed water tower? I have to wonder. And if they really did use standpipe water towers, well, why did they ever go away from them? They seemed to be beautiful and they worked well, although allegedly this one was retired after 30 years. And now the next standpipe water tower in St. Louis, because there's more than one. This is the Bissell Street Water Tower, and this is 206 feet tall. The Compton Water Tower we just looked at before was 179 feet tall. Again, another very beautiful standpipe water tower, and we're told this one was built in 1886. And now we come to the piece of resistance of water towers in St. Louis, the third standpipe water tower. The Grand Avenue Water Tower, and at 154 feet, it is the tallest freestanding Corinthian column in the world. Yes, we had to build a freestanding Corinthian column, the tallest in the world, around a water tower. Don't you find this interesting? One has to wonder why this is the situation. And if you look at the layout of the neighborhoods around these water towers, they're very interesting as well, and definitely warrant more detailed exploration. A giant, freestanding Corinthian column. Now on to the Civil Courts Building, our patented Art Deco building for the city. Yes, the Civil Courts Building, built in 1930. Interestingly enough, as though it wasn't impressive that they were trying to compete with the old courthouse, which, as we said earlier, looks like a state capitol, this one they decided to model the top after the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And why not? Why wouldn't you do this in 1930, right after the Great Depression hit? You need to make sure that you have the most beautiful, ornate, and opulent top to your building, that's a civil court building no less, that there is nothing in the world that can compete with it. And apparently, cost is no object. You can do this and you can pull it off. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and they put it on top of a building in St. Louis. And this is very beautiful. And it's ornate, and it's detailed, and we have to wonder how they did it. And I was very curious when I saw this, so I searched feverishly for construction photos of this incredible building. In my search, I found the photos of the statues on the top of it. Yes, nothing says American democracy or courts as these statues do. It's also interesting how old they appear already, although this is a more modern picture, because we can see the modern and very un-old world arch in the background. Look at the symbolism on these figures. Tell me in the comments what this reminds you of. And what's the symbol that seems to be on the chest of one of these figures? What do they really represent? And how would this have been something that was put up there during the Art Deco period? Something that defies simple explanation. And it is very intriguing that these statues do happen to rest right in the middle of the arch. Almost as though the arch was built simply to decorate the statues in a photo. Well, here's the construction photo I came across. And yes, you have your girders and your very questionable construction photo. Maybe it was a foggy or dusty day when they took it. You'd think they'd have some construction photos from the ground looking up or something like that, but, it was in the late 1920s, and maybe they just didn't have the capability to do that yet. Ah, I enjoy this one. Now, why would they have three individuals putting a top on the column here? And look at the foot there on that gentleman in the front. Do you think he's really holding on securely to that scaffolding with his foot? One wrong step, and the next thing you know, your workforce is doing a Wile E. Coyote all the way to the ground at terminal velocity. Well, I guess it was either work or die, put yourself at extreme risk, or you would starve, because obviously there was no labor available on the farms, only children could do that. This is another one of those inexplicable photos, but by all means, let me know what you think in the comments. Why exactly did they have to line up the top of this column in that manner? Okay, enough of that. Let's take a look at some schools here to close out St. Louis. And here we have the towers of Robert S. Brookings Hall in Washington University, St. Louis. It's not a castle, is it? It just looks like a castle. Or is it a bunch of towers? But, as someone told me on Reddit, a castle can really be anything. And, of course, you see the archway here and the ornate detail around the windows. I'm reminded of one of the schools I looked at in Duluth, although if memory serves, that was a college, or at least that's what they said it was. And, I guess it's just how we have to build out our colleges. Interesting with the stones around the doorway. And then look at how beautiful and detailed those figures are right there. For a high school. And here, a college. And we've seen both. And again, what's with the point of the parapets? In case the students decide to go up there and reenact some action scenes from their favorite medieval novels. You got a little broken window there. But it still looks very beautiful. Why would this kind of effort be put into just a school? This is Summer High School. Summer High School, very old photo. And we see some of the familiar construction cues that we've come across in other locations. The little tower, the Piedmont, or the little triangular Roman Forum looking device, and of course columns and pillars, along with a lot of chimneys. And you have to wonder what the original intention of this building was, because once again, this is something that defies simple explanation. And to close out, I just wanted to include this photo. Supposedly this is repaving a street in St. Louis. And I've never actually seen a photo like this where it looks like they're playing Jenga with replacing the individual blocks in the road. And is this all the larger their crew is? I mean, it looks like we have maybe 6, 7 individuals down at the end, a couple people gawking and watching, and then these 3 just standing there. Look, it's a bunch of blocks on the road. Yep. Well, do you know where they go? I'll just keep standing and looking, and maybe the blocks will go where they're supposed to go. What do you think of this photo? Let me know in the comments. Now, I know that in this exploration of St. Louis, there are many more things that we can take a look at, and we will. There's museums, there's other beautiful, ornate, old-world buildings in St. Louis. It is full of them. These are just some of the ones that really stood out, and this is really just an introduction to the beautiful city of St. Louis. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me for our exploration of Kansas City, Paris of the Old World Plains. The beautiful Kansas City, located at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers on the western side of Missouri. A little known fact that many people overlook is that Kansas City actually has a greater population than St. Louis. A very beautiful city that is quite worthy of the title Paris of the Old World Plains. And yet there are many mysteries behind Kansas City that we're going to explore. We see where Kansas City is located, right in the geographic center of the United States and the geographic intersection of many great railroads. And this is quite a consideration when we think about what the capital city of a pre-existing civilization may have been. Now, recent explorations, which I even heard on John Levi's channel, indicate that perhaps Winnipeg was one of the major capitals of the North American continent. And there's no reason that can't be true. But considering some of the cities that exist in the United States, we have to consider the fact that Kansas City being at the major intersection point of so many existing railroads certainly lends to its potential prominence as one of the great cities of the pre-existing civilization. Now, could it be possible that Kansas City was built on a pre-existing civilization, or it was a quote-unquote founded city? Absolutely. And was it also a city that existed in previous eras that we theorize on this channel, with the eras that preceded the civilization before? Well, looking at what our contemporary historical account gives us, this is what Kansas City looked like in 1855. We have the usual story that the Native Americans roamed the lands, and then it was controlled by the French, and then briefly the Spanish, and then back to the French. Then it was acquired by the United States and Louisiana Purchase, and Lewis and Clark came by during their little expedition to the Pacific, and they said, this looks like a good place to build a fort. Well, after that, Missouri became a state in the 1820s, and then they slowly built it up, and at the time it was simply known as the town of Kansas, until for some reason it became the city of Kansas, although who knows if that has anything to do with population. Interesting conflicting accounts. This was also the area where the Mormons had settled, and they view Jackson County as a very charmed and religiously important area. In any event, there was a conflict called the Mormon War in 1838. Although casualty figures from that war are very difficult to come by, we only know that there were 22 who died, and it says unknown civilian dead and wounded. So I guess it's not a very well-documented conflict, but just because something's not well-documented, at least we have an account that it happened. Yes, this is Father Donnelly, priest, mason, engineer, historian. He was from Ireland, but he was one of the, well, perhaps you could call him the first great citizen of Kansas City, as he led efforts to pave the streets and clear out these incredible mounds and hills that overlooked the Missouri River on the north side of Kansas City. These photos are very interesting, and they're supposedly from 1860 to 1880, when Father Donnelly brought in many Irish workers to clear out this area. This is another interesting photo, supposedly from 1870, that shows a levee. Although maybe somebody in the comments would like to point out to me where they actually see a levee in this photo. Very bizarre, and this is quite reminiscent of the photos that we saw when we looked at Seattle. So what's exactly the situation here? Did they just decide to plant this city in very difficult terrain and not locate it just slightly down the river? If you go a little ways east on the Missouri River, you've got some nice flat terrain. Who knows what the real situation was, but it gives the indication that there was something that was already existing there that they decided that they were going to work through, especially when you see photos like this. Now, are these photos real? Could they have been altered? Could there be some other story behind them? Absolutely. Regardless, though, they are as part of the official archives, and they do paint a very different picture of what was actually happening in Kansas City in the 19th century. As always, I leave it up to you. Perhaps you believe that it is well documented enough, and that this story, even if it doesn't make sense logistically, is sensible, and it holds up for how Kansas City got its start. I was completely unaware, though, that there was this massive effort to clear out and do this kind of landscaping excavation project just to enable the downtown of Kansas City to be built. Much as I was unaware about the same thing with Seattle, and yet they even call these large areas canyons. I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. And perhaps it tells a different story as to what was actually going on in Kansas City in this time. Perhaps really what they were doing was that they were digging out what really remained and what had to be found. Or perhaps it really is, as the historical account gives us, that Father Donnelly was a genius, a jack of all trades, and it would be easier to say what his talents weren't than what they were. However, there are many pictures from many decades that show that there were large bluffs. So it's very difficult to ascertain exactly what was happening. But it provides many different clues, and again, it presents many conflicting accounts. And then we look at the bird's eye map of Kansas City from the 1870s, and we see that it's already grown from the earlier one that we saw from the 1860s, supposedly. Very well-defined grid pattern, which it continues to have to this day. And you can even see the downtown where it runs up to the Missouri River. And you see a very interesting turning bridge as well there. Very intriguing. I suppose it would make sense to allow the riverboat traffic to get through there. We also see, though, that it seems to have a very well-developed infrastructure, even for this early time. We see many massive buildings and structures that have already been completed. And, of course, we'll be told that this was due to the efforts of the early settlers and Father Donnelly and the efforts of the Irish settlers. I wonder if somebody in the comments section is going to tell me that there was some great Irish person who only has one name that built their house that they still live in Kansas City to this day. I look forward to reading that in the comments today. Well, look at that with that turning bridge. Wonderful technology, and certainly a remarkable engineering achievement for that time. Here's a picture of that bridge. Now, what exactly is this telling us? You can see some of the stone on it, and once again, the stone looks like it's a little older than perhaps it should be, but we'll just explain that away by saying it's the architectural process of rustication, although I've been fascinated by how many times that term is used. Other early pictures of Kansas City do sort of give the idea that it was the classic frontier town, or the western city that we like to think of when we think of our mythical view of the American West. And yet we see other conflicting aspects in these pictures, many of these structures being made of brick if you look closely. Or perhaps they're made of some other substance that merely resembles brick. Not sure, but again, the dating on these photos is always open to question. And here's the Kansas City stockyards, Kansas City being in the very middle of the American Midwest and being a major intersection point for the compilation and processing of cattle. In fact, this was the second largest stockyard next to Chicago, which was quite legendary. Quite an impressive compound and extremely large with many different structures to it. And if you should ever have the pleasure of dining in 801 Shop House in Kansas City in the Power and Light District, they still have a great picture of this that's posted up there. Very interesting views, though, of the city, because we go from that to suddenly having very advanced buildings and, of course, our electric trolleys. And these ones don't appear to be being pulled by horses, although the road looks awfully muddy there. So, once again, perhaps Father Donnelly and his crew didn't get around to that. And then we go a little later, and we still see a little bit of a mix of some of the very advanced buildings, like that dome over there. And we see early automobiles. So what's really going on in Kansas City? Well, we seem to have many different accounts, and we also have accounts of many floods that seem to change things around and require a new train station to be built and different buildings to be torn down and rebuilt, and of course our usual story. It seems that every single city in the United States has gone through either a flood, a fire, a tornado, or some combination of these unfortunate disasters. This is an early photo, and you can see the Power and Light building there, a building that we have the pleasure of exploring today as it's still with us. Of course, we'll be told that it's an Art Deco building. Here's the earlier Union Station in Kansas City, not located at the same location as the present Union Station, which is quite an impressive structure. But looking at this old one, we still see it's an impressive structure. And look at all the power line poles there. Ah, yes, here is the individual, I'll be told, who built their house. The legendary Irish man named O'Brien. He has no other name, and I'm sure he built someone's house on the hill. And they'll be telling me all about it in the comments. And here is a picture of the current Union Station in Kansas City. Supposedly built in 4 years, 1910 to 1914. And it's something I've looked at before on one of the earliest videos on the channel. But I thought it fitting to go back there and explore it in person. And today you'll find that the interstate system, which ties Kansas City to the surrounding cities and allows you easy access to it, allows many beautiful views of an incredible landscape. And you can see that this city is built up on a hill and has a very prominent view. Looking at its impressive skyline to this day, though, we can see that many old world buildings have survived to this day. Although many people argue, are these actually old world buildings? Well, the City Hall, the County Courthouse, which just happen to be located right next to each other, we'll be taking a closer look at those. That's what'll greet you as you come into the city and you wander around the Power and Light District. Now, it should be noted that I decided to go conduct my on-the-ground exploration of Kansas City on the hottest days of the year because I'm dedicated. And not to mention that Kansas City is just a fun place to walk around. Add text, yes. And there's my little joke there because you have all these little Art Deco buildings that are located so close to each other. You have a City Hall located next to a county courthouse. That's the City Hall. On the right's the county courthouse. And you can see that there's no shortage of beautiful architecture. Well, let's start with the New England building, constructed in 1886. And we see the hallmarks of the beautiful architecture, the finest of what will be told by the official historical account of the 19th century, with all the beautiful decorations. And I always love it when they have those protruding corner areas off the building. We'll see other fine stones and beautiful decorations, as though there was no limitation in labor or the ability to decorate. And of course we'll be told that there were many fine craftsmen who were just wandering the lands. And of course you had priests who were talented in everything from being architects to stonemasons to being able to pave streets. Oh, and they were also mathematicians and brilliant historians. Yes, all these things are told to us about the wonderful Father Bernard Donnelly. And I don't mean to discredit him, but that's very interesting. You look closely at some of these blocks and you see how large they really are, and you have to consider the challenges that whoever really built this went through when they constructed it. And everywhere you look in this city, you see beautiful architecture. There is no shortage of it. You just walk anywhere in the downtown and you'll see that there is a lot of old world architecture that survives. Beautiful and unfiltered. And looking up at this beautiful building, just incredible. I always love looking at these little corner towers that protrude like this. The New York Life building, built in 1890, and here we see another very large block building, whether it's sandstone, limestone. We'll be told many different materials for the composition, but very impressive with the columns down there by the very large door and an archway. And I really enjoy that eagle motif there. Very beautiful. And what exactly was the original function or purpose behind this building? We can only speculate. However, it stands today, it's very beautiful, and it seems to be doing quite well. That's certainly not something that you see, though, in many buildings, an eagle statue like that that's just overlooking the doorway. And, of course, we have our windows that look like they were built right in the ground. But anywhere you look, you're going to see any kind of neat architecture in Kansas City, whether you're looking at what's titled as the fire department, interesting with the pediment and these columns here. I'm also impressed by the scale of it. Well, they're not going to have any issues with anything happening to their fire department building, that's for sure. But wherever you look in Kansas City, you'll see this kind of architecture in these beautiful old world buildings. It's very impressive. And again, we see the same thing here with the columns and the very large blocks, and even over here on this church with what appears to be a gold-plated tower. I'm reminded of the Iowa State Capitol once again. And this financial holding corporation building, whatever you really want to call it, with the many columns. These do not look sectional. And then, of course, that decorative motif up there by the roof. I also noticed there were some areas where they were doing some construction. You could kind of see some of the older pieces of the city. I always find these little areas with this excavation interesting to look at, because perhaps there's some clues to be found. Well, now we go to the Power and Light building in 1931. And apparently Kansas City did not seem to suffer the effects of the Great Depression, or they made the most of it, because we're going to find out that they built a slew of beautiful Art Deco buildings during the height of the Great Depression, no less. So a good 2 years after the stock market crash, and they managed to throw up this beauty. And this is definitely one of the most beautiful Art Deco buildings I've seen on the exterior. Stepping back from it a little bit, we saw that it had that very unique tower top to it, and we'll take a closer look at that as well. But right now I just want to focus on some of the decorations on the side of it. And there you can see the tower with the little sun motif on the top of it. All the trimmings of the classic Art Deco building, but then decorated all the way from the bottom to the top floor. It's very intriguing whenever you consider these Art Deco buildings and all the effort that they clearly committed in terms of whoever actually built them, because again, the Art Deco buildings I always find very questionable. I find the year very questionable, and this is one of the main decorations that you're going to see on the Power and Light building. Very impressive and very beautiful. And usually what we'll see with some buildings that they'll tell us are Art Deco but really aren't Art Deco is they tend to lack these beautiful decorations. I could not find the exact name of this building that's right next to the Power and Light building, but it's just as beautiful with many of the decorative touches. Not exactly sure what year we're going to be told this was built, but look at this with all the little pediments there above the windows and some of the decorations on the roof line, and then even some of the symbols up there. So it continues that wherever you look in Kansas City, you're going to see amazing things, such as B&B Theaters, constructed in 1924. And look at the dome on this with the portal windows. And we've seen those patterns before in other cities that we've looked at that we see in the windows. Very impressive architecture. and very beautiful for a theater that was built in the 1920s. Although I suppose it's a little more sensible that something like this was constructed in the 1920s when it was the roaring 20s, or at least the economy, so we're told by the official historical account, was doing well in the United States. And again, you see little decorations on the side of it. Now walking back down to the west, the Municipal Auditorium, built in 1935, again during the height of the so-called Great Depression. Maybe they just should have called it the Great Building Boom in Kansas City. Interesting symbol. Why does that look familiar? And then we see that they decided to put a couple other symbols on this building because, again, it being the Great Depression, and there was no issue just finding labor and having money to bring in these very giant blocks. Again, I have to ask the question in terms of what kind of material this really is. Is this some sort of concrete? Is this Portland cement? Something about this, again, gives the clue that this is much more enduring cement. And for some reason, I'm once again reminded of Roman concrete. The Jackson County Courthouse, constructed in 1934. Another building built during the Great Depression, and it features a nice statue of Andrew Jackson in front of it. This isn't a county courthouse. This is a county court building extravaganza. And look at the beautiful artwork on the front of this building. Look at these reliefs. Very impressive and very beautiful. Now, while I was actually standing there admiring all this beautiful architecture, it looked like there was a little bit of a property auction going on in the front, but few people attended. This is the previous courthouse in Kansas City, and the one before this was destroyed by a tornado, I suppose not too surprising. But as you can see in this image, it's a very impressive structure itself. So I guess they felt they had to throw up an Art Deco building, and it had to be utterly extravagant. I even like the little tower rook piece there. Look at the detailing above this very large doorway. It definitely gives you the feeling of stepping through a portal as though you're going into some other sort of world. And you see these incredible reliefs above it. And then going up the length of the building. Right across the street from it is the Kansas City City Hall, because why not put the City Hall next to the county courthouse? And this was built 1935 to 1937, and we see many of the same hallmarks of the architecture, and once again during the height of the Great Depression. Although they did manage to finish this, it seems, before the next economic downturn that hit the United States in 1937, but people tend not to talk about that. Franklin Roosevelt was very convincing in his fireside chats. Again, just another incredibly beautiful building with beautiful artistic work all over it, as though they had infinite time and resources, and during the Great Depression, no less, that they were able to establish this. I even enjoy the way the steps go up to the top of it. It's very intriguing to me, though, because in the cities that we've looked at so far, I haven't exactly seen a county courthouse and a city hall that have been located next to each other like this. Look at the artwork and the relief. There's just something otherworldly about this. Now, if we really had the ability to do this in the 1930s, and we can't do this now, or we opt not to do this now, then how far have we truly fallen? And just for a little contrast, as I was leaving the area, I saw the Richard Bolling Federal Building, and I just wanted to show you what kind of architecture we tend to go with today. Ah, yes, look at that beauty. We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender. Resistance is futile. I definitely get those feelings when I look at this building. Well, now Kansas City Union Station, finished in 1914, and probably one of the most impressive pieces of architecture in this entire city. One of the most grand Union stations, and we consider the Union Station we looked at in St. Louis, and it was very impressive, a castle-like structure, and yet this is just a mammoth structure that defies simple explanation. This is a train station that was built to replace an earlier train station, and look how incredibly beautiful it is. Look how large it is. And then even all around it, you see other very beautiful structures. And eventually, Liberty Memorial, or the National World War I Memorial, as it's called now. And we see the history behind Union Station in Kansas City. And of course, it was the flood in 1903 that they refer to, and now they talk about how they've commemorated it. And you can see that it's standing up quite well. And it's also very incredibly large. Looking down, though, I see a little bit of a different concrete, though, in the floors that appear to be below the ground. And that's very interesting. And then studying the rest of the building, and of course we have our usual pediments and our decorations, and just appreciating the massive size. But it's when you go inside this building that you're completely blown away. Why do you need to have ceilings that are 90 to 110 feet high? And look at the beautiful decorations on the ceilings. and the walls and the large blocks. 1910 to 1914. And then I don't want to forget the floor, which has beautiful patterns on it. And it appears to be an entirely hard surface, whether it's made of granite or some other material that we can't properly identify. Because as I said, looking at enough of these buildings up close and personal, I've started to question all this. Like this little clock here that goes down the main gallery, and of course we have other beautiful symbols and motifs, and the usual trademark of the very large pillars that are built into the wall. This is all very incredibly impressive. Ah yes, another one of those clocks that has 4 eyes or 4 ones instead of the IV on it. And just to give you a better view of the beautiful floor, and this is the main gallery. I couldn't access all of it because there was a convention there, but it gives you an idea of how large it really was. This is where the people waited for their trains. And of course, you know, when you're waiting for a train, you need to have a ceiling that's over 100 feet high and well decorated, so you can look up and imagine that you're in a very large environment. I don't know, perhaps a lot of people were claustrophobic back then. They do have some plans setting up in Union Station, and it gives you the idea that, once again, perhaps this was recorded? I don't know. I mean, I guess you only need 2 perspectives to really be able to effectively design a building. I examined some of the blocks and noticed some of the construction behind them, and you can see some of the concrete is cracking. But it's very interesting that a lot of the concrete, or whatever this building is truly made of, is standing up very well. It's over 100 years old. Well, since it was 102 degrees that day, I decided it would be fun to just skip up the stairs and go to the Liberty Memorial. Now, I call it the Liberty Memorial because that's what it was originally called, the giant tower that you see there in the distance, well over 200 feet tall and a very impressive structure in and of itself. The monument that was dedicated to the veterans of World War I in the United States. They supposedly completed it in 1926, although there's conflicting accounts on that, and you can find construction photos, but make of them what you will. I was still very impressed, though, by this structure, and since the temperature being what it was, I pretty much had the entire structure to myself. Ah, yes, the IRS Tax Center. Beautiful building with some great pillars in it. I'm not going to bother looking up what the stated date on that is because, well, let's just say I question it, even if it's well documented. Look at this beautiful relief, though, here on the front of the Liberty Memorial. Very interesting and very intriguing with the detail that you see behind this. And once again, I mean, I see some figures that look like they could be soldiers from World War I, but we see a lot of other questioning figures on that interesting relief. Ascending the stairs, you go up onto the main memorial itself, and you see the great giant tower. And I'm not sure how many stairs I climbed at this point, but I made it, and we have a couple sphinxes that have wings over their eyes because apparently they're covering their eyes from the terror of the war to end all wars, and we saw how accurate that was. And then, of course, you have the main tower, which is in the center. Now, it should be noted that underneath this tower is where the actual World War I museum is located. Yes, as though they added that as an afterthought. And it should be noted that this was funded by local prominent citizens in Kansas City, and then, of course, from donations. And you see you have a great view of Union Station and the downtown of Kansas City. And this just gives you an idea of how large Union Station is, as you can see the vehicles parked near it. And there on the left, you can see the Power and Light building that we looked at earlier. You can see the county courthouse and the city hall. And some other very impressive buildings that continue with us today. And of course, they've surrounded them by the beautiful postmodern brutalist buildings that we prefer today. Looking up at this tower, though, you can see one of the giant guardian figures. Well, at least we know Kansas City would never rename their sports team to a Guardian. This is a mystery building that I found near the Arts Center, and there'll be a special members video that's going to cover what this building's all about. We see a couple signs of old world architecture, but there's actually a lot more behind this building. It's a very intriguing story. And it certainly reinforces the narrative that someone might be trying to mislead us on our explorations, and I can't imagine why anybody would do that. And now we look at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, built in 1933. Yet another incredibly beautiful building that was built during the Great Depression. And of course, we're told that it's from the generous efforts of a couple real estate developers in Kansas City, Nelson, a gentleman, and Atkins, a lady, who decided to devote their funds to build this incredibly beautiful gallery of art, which of course has columns, and on the inside you find that it's an even more beautiful building. Marble columns, which I checked and confirmed that these are all marble, at least what we think of as marble. Very beautiful floor and beautiful skylights. Now, I find it fascinating that this building is filled with beautiful artwork, because it's almost as though you come there to see the artwork and you'll miss the architecture if you're not really paying attention to it. And I look and I see all this incredibly beautiful architecture and art mixed on the inside of this building. Very impressive entryway too. When you look at the roof and the walls, it's unbelievably beautiful, and it's almost as though you're going into some kind of old church. And yet this was supposedly built in the 1930s. And look at some of the beautiful detail here on the entryway by this very large door. Once again, I mean, I understand that this is supposedly an art gallery, but we were building this in Kansas City at the same time we were building all these other buildings. I went in and looked at some of the paintings because I was impressed by what I saw, and once again, it's almost as though you have a different technique with the painting. They seem so lifelike with the faces and the depictions. And this is the August the Strong, Elector of Saxony. And I looked at some of these other paintings, and while they're supposedly from the 18th century, we see ruins in them. Little pyramid there with the pediment and some columns on it. And then over here in this painting, more ruins. So very intriguing that they're depicting ruins and then some large structure there in the background. And of course, when you look up what these paintings are really about and what they're depicting, they'll always give you some explanation. But again, I wonder if this is just something where we just write something down, and then people who like to say, well, it's very well documented, so I'm just going to believe what I'm told, and that's good enough for me. Even if, one county's well-documented history completely conflicts with another county's well-documented history, I'm sure somebody got it right. Isn't this intriguing here? Very, very beautiful, and another painting depicting what appear to be very advanced building construction techniques with many arches, a beautiful clock, and of course, no shortage of columns. And I suppose you can explain this away. Look at that building there on to the left. And what's the detail behind this one? The clock tower in the Piazza San Marco, 1728. And, it wouldn't be a complete set of paintings to look at unless we found a couple domes with some beautiful towers on them and some very ornate architecture. I'm going to guess this is Venice, but I could be wrong. Very beautiful. And once again, someone to be seeing this and painting it is quite incredible to me. Yes. And then looking at some other paintings, you can see the same details, little structure in the background there. But then also pulling out, I just wanted to show you that this is a painting that's on a wall here in the art gallery, just surrounded by marble. So I'm beginning to wonder exactly what's the original purpose and intention of this building. I mean, we can accept that it was built in the 1930s and that all these incredible works of art just happen to end up on it. But I'd like to hear your comments and your opinions on what you think this is. Look at how beautiful this entryway is. Well, I'll close out with the Kansas City Country Club Plaza, supposedly built in the 1920s, opened in 1924, 1925, depending what account you look at. And you have some very beautiful structures that are supposedly reminiscent of wonderful structures in Spain. As though, once again, the 1920s, well, again, at least we were in an economic boom, the roaring 20s, you can see some of this beautiful architecture in Kansas City. And it's quite incredible when you look at the little details on this. And this was just supposed to be an imitation architecture, yet this is coming up on 100 years old, and it's still holding up this well. The Country Club Plaza, a very beautiful place to visit, and of course what Kansas City will tell you it's for is for shopping. They just happen to throw some beautiful architecture up in it because, they had nothing better to do with their time. And this is where Kansas City got the title of City of the Fountains, because this is where you'll find many of the beautiful fountains as well. So once again, more conflicting accounts, and yet many beautiful towers, beautiful buildings with beautiful decoration on it, all to build a shopping center. I mean, oh yeah, look at that little face up there. Isn't that very intriguing? I even like the little beard and the mustache. So what's that really depicting? Everywhere you look, yes, we have another little dome here. And a very well-developed tower on that. There's just nowhere you can go in Kansas City without seeing incredible beauty and what appears to be vast, copious amounts of old-world architecture everywhere you look that defies simple explanation. And I'll be honest, despite the fact that it was over 100 degrees, I enjoyed every minute that I was in Kansas City, just to be able to see these incredible, beautiful works of art and these beautiful buildings. However, there was just one slight issue with Kansas City. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we'll be conducting an exploration of New Orleans, the last Old World city. New Orleans, supposedly founded in 1718 by the Kingdom of France at the time, the city has changed hands a few times, being under the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of Spain, the First Republic of France, and the United States. It's a beautiful city, and it's been with us since 1718, but of course they'll tell us that it was founded, so I guess any year in the United States is just not enough time to say that we actually built a city. Or they're just being honest with us in a way. We look at one of the original plans of New Orleans, and we see an incredible star fort structure around it from this rendering, supposedly composed in 1763. Very beautiful, and yet fascinating that there are so many plots of land planned out for structures that don't exist yet. And what was the original function of the star fort that was built around the city? Is it still there? Are there signs of it under the ground? It's very intriguing when we consider the fact that we believe that star forts are a sign of earlier civilizations, and we see no lack of it for this composition planning out New Orleans. How was it that the French knew that New Orleans was going to accede to such an incredible city? Regardless, it's very beautiful, and let's take a look at an 1851 bird's eye view. Now, this is after New Orleans was under the jurisdiction of the United States. And look at this. Very beautiful, well built out buildings in 1851. And not just the landmark buildings that we'd expect to see. We see beautiful columns, beautiful towers. It's very staggering to consider all the detail that you already see in 1851. It's also interesting that we see that all of these buildings appear to be either masonry, stone, granite, limestone. We see beautiful domes. What exactly to make of this? The official historical account will tell us that in the 18th century, the 1700s, there was a great fire in New Orleans, and that's what necessitated the building of all these incredible buildings. Yet I can't help but consider the fact that perhaps we're looking at the remnants of a true old world city. Look at all the pediments and the columns that are already present. And there's also a lot of strife associated with New Orleans. I know that other explorers have looked at it very closely, and I know they've been amazed, and one could spend all day just looking at this 1851 bird's eye view of New Orleans and just being amazed at the detail in the architecture and all the effort that had to be expended to complete all these buildings. It's also interesting in the fact that we consider that New Orleans is a city that has lost a lot of its architecture over time. In other words, many of the buildings have been destroyed, and we'll be looking at that here in the video to consider some of these beautiful buildings that have been lost. Others are still with us, fortunately. However, considering the entire picture of New Orleans, originally founded in 1718, changing hands from the French to the Spanish after the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War as it was called in the United States, or in America at the time, and then going over to the First French Republic during the Napoleonic era, and then back to the United States after the Louisiana Purchase in the early 19th century, which is where a lot of interesting world events happened. We look at other pictures of the city and we see the same kind of beauty, the very well built out buildings, the domes, the towers in the distance, and it's quite amazing. I'm also forced to consider what happened to the star fort that surrounded the city originally. Was that just something that was drawn in that old rendering, or was that something that really existed? There are some small star forts that still exist around New Orleans, and yet looking at other renderings, we're no less amazed by what we see with the detail with these incredibly beautiful buildings, these tall obelisks, and all these domes that are everywhere at the same time. Of course, defenders of the mainstream account will tell us that there was ample time, that it all makes sense, that 1718 to now was plenty of time, and of course the fire at the end of the 18th century is what necessitated the construction of all these buildings, and it was apparently no problem. And there's even another explanation, the fact that this was supposed to be a prime colonial city for the French. Okay, it makes sense, and yet it sure seems like the French let go of the city, along with the entire Louisiana Purchase, rather easily, despite the fact that Napoleon was in charge. Oh well, make of it what you will. Looking here, we see the beautiful cathedral that we'll be taking a look at later and examining in full detail, and the St. Louis or St. Louis Cathedral, however you want to pronounce it. Supposedly under control of both the French and the Spanish did renovations to it. The French originally built it. It's been added to it. Has a conflicting account with it. Also look at what you see here, though, right off of the Mississippi with some of the beautiful and well-developed buildings. Now, of course, we can always say that these composed pictures could have been done at any point in time, and that's very true. And any artist can paint whatever they want to, or they can depict whatever they want to. So does this necessarily prove anything? The answer is no. But it's very interesting to consider that either this was someone's imagination, or they were looking at something that was real and they were interpreting what they saw as real. What year did it really happen? Well, we know how many conflicting accounts that we have in the 19th century. If you've watched this channel before, it's quite an intriguing premise to consider. There's never any shortage of things to see where it comes to Louisiana and New Orleans. We see the depiction here of the cathedral, and is this really a picture? Is this some sort of sketch picture? It's hard to say. It's certainly not of the best quality. And yet we see other painted pictures where we see the same thing. Domes and towers in the distance, and yet a very well built out waterfront. What exactly is this reflecting to us? It seems to be showing us that New Orleans was a very well built out city, and that's one of the reasons why I opted for the last old world city. There's a lot of evidence that New Orleans was perhaps the last fully intact old world city before it was altered over time. If we go with the five eras theory as our primary theory for what we're considering with the presence of previous civilizations that we're not supposed to talk about and we're not supposed to consider. We look at some other actual photos of New Orleans and we see again the very well built out residential area with the beautiful bell towers and the other beautiful towers, and we look at all this effort that went into it. We're also well aware of the fact that New Orleans, based on its position with the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico and the surrounding waterways, is susceptible to flooding. Pretty much anyone who's been around longer than 10 years is well aware of what's happened with the hurricanes in the past, most notably Hurricane Katrina. Here we see another one of these pictures where we have the horses pulling the trolley, and we see this very well built out cobblestone roadway. And these pictures we're told are either from the 1890s to the 1920s. Of course, what's the actual time? You can always ask questions. Is this photo from the 1890s or is it from a later portion in time? Of course, when you see horses pulling the trolley, you'll automatically think, well, it must be from before the 1890s when they electrified the trolleys, as we just seem to have electricity go across the entire nation of the United States in a very rapid amount of time. Beautiful photos, though, and beautiful buildings, and look at this kind of detail. And when you compare the elaborate architecture and detail that went in this one building, and then look at the roadway around it, it's definitely the conflicting account that you see in the picture itself. It paints an entirely different picture from a city that we're told was around since 1718, but had to be rebuilt from a fire, because that's always the story. Isn't this interesting when you see these buildings here and the tracks in the road? And again, it goes back to the question, what came first, the tracks or the road? Here we have President McKinley addressing the august body of New Orleans in 1901 prior to his unfortunate assassination at the World's Fair in Buffalo. Very beautiful building, and yet it doesn't exactly look like what remains there today. There seem to be some subtle differences. And we see other gorgeous buildings, and how many of these buildings are still there in New Orleans and how many have unfortunately been torn down over the years. It seems to be a situation in many cities across the United States where you have certain buildings that seem to have survived and yet other ones that have not. And look at this very vast crowd here, and look at some of the buildings that we see with some of the beautiful towers. And look at the variance in the towers that you see. You've got bell towers, you've got some of the more traditional towers that we see, and unique designs. It's obvious, though, that there is nothing within this city that really escapes our attention to detail when we see these gigantic columns in this building. Very beautiful. And how long has it really been there? What was the original construction behind it? Well, New Orleans is known in the United States for the War of 1812, where we had General General Andrew Jackson, who led what was perhaps the greatest American victory of the War of 1812. And if you know anything about the official account of the War of 1812, the United States military didn't exactly perform well there. But we'll start by looking at our star forts around New Orleans. Fort Macomb and Fort Pike. Fort Pike is very well preserved, and Fort Macomb is not so well preserved, being grown over. However, it does show us that there are the presence of star forts in the New Orleans area. And we always suspect that star forts represent the previous civilization. Now here's Fort Macomb we'll look at first, and it's very well grown over, but yet you can still see the fine details and shapes, the geometric shapes that always accompany a star fort. And there's a lot of theories for what these smaller star forts may have represented. Were they drains, or were they some sort of valve control system? Here's Fort Pike, and we can see that it's much more well-maintained. And we go back to that theory of drains, and perhaps there's something to that with the fact that both these star forts are right on the entryway of the Mississippi going past New Orleans. Not sure, but it's very beautiful when you look at the geometric patterns, and the preservation on it's amazing. We'll be told by the official historical account, though, that these star forts were constructed from 1819 to 1824 because bricks were in abundant supply and transporting these things were no issue. Logistics was just not a problem in the 19th century. Even though you didn't have motor transportation at the time, railways supposedly were limited, and it was also very difficult in terms of logistically sustaining the workforce that would have been required, human and animal, to build such a structure. However, we go with the historical account, and it was only 5 years, and they managed to complete these amazing structures that stand today, even if they're grown over. Yes, they had cannons. Yes, they could defend it. And just look at the detail and the symmetry in this wall. And also pay attention to the ridges there near the top of it. It's quite an incredible image, and it reflects the fact that there seems to have been a previous civilization that was very obviously present in Louisiana. Well, anyway, that's enough star forts. Let's take a look at the city hell. What the hell is this? Brutalist architecture, 1950s building? This is the city hall? How did this get in the presentation? Who's responsible for this? Oh, there we go. Gallier Hall, built 1845 to 1853. The original city hall of New Orleans. And the unfortunate tragedy is we see that many of these beautiful old municipal buildings have been replaced by these lovely, and I say that in all sarcasm, brutalist architecture buildings of the 1950s and beyond. But here we see a more traditional, quote-unquote, neoclassical building with the columns and the pediment, and we can see that this is a very worthy city hall for any city anywhere in the world. So why exactly did they have to replace this one? Well, you'll find the usual slew of reasons that, well, it just wasn't meeting the needs at the time, it wasn't large enough, or they just didn't have enough rooms for people to sit around and wait for their bureaucratic processes to be completed. Very beautiful building, and very impressive that it was supposedly built in the mid-19th century, although we certainly question that. It's almost though there's something even more gorgeous about this particular pediment, and I can't quite put my finger on it. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. I love the interiors too. Now, even though they're not using this as a city hall, we should be thankful that this building continues to survive. I love the interiors because while they may not be as well decorated, or at least putting as much artistic decoration in this building, it does give the impression though of the quality of this building. And you can get the feeling that this is a building where you would feel that relaxed, inspired feeling just walking in. And yet we still see some of the artistic beauty on the ceiling with the chandeliers and of course the usual checkerboard floor pattern. I also wonder how much of this has been due to the quote-unquote renovations that occur to where they're making this building appear, how shall we say, a little bit more modest on the inside than what was originally intended. I love the entryway here too with the columns and the doorway. Very, very large door, but you remember that saying from an LA story from Steve Martin, you're nobody in the city unless you have a very large door. And of course the old city hall had a very large door. I have a feeling the new one doesn't have a large door, but we're not going to look. Very beautiful. Look at this hallway. You can still see the signs of what a gorgeous building this was in its prime. And frankly, it's still in its prime. The fact that it's still standing and they haven't torn it down says a lot. Look at the pillars there integrated in the wall, the chandeliers, and the ceiling again, and of course the floor. You know, even the stairways, you can still see some of the details in the banister that survive, and that's something else to look for when you look at these old municipal buildings. I wonder if you could possibly enjoy being in the modern New Orleans City Hall as much as you would enjoy being in this building. Well, I'm sure there are some people who enjoy sitting around having their bureaucratic processes take all day, or several weeks, or months, depending on the case. This is another one of these rooms where you just get that feeling of beauty and decor, even though it looks a little bit modest by what we've seen in some of the other old world buildings. Well, let's move on to the Eleanor McMain Secondary School from 1932. This is an Art Deco secondary school. Now, we've only really seen one Art Deco school in Salt Lake City so far in the explorations on this channel. And I thought this one was interesting to consider as well because this building is still with us, but it's another building, unfortunately, that's fallen prey, if you will, to the Art Deco renovation. Now, we'll be told it's because they had to redo the building, they had to renovate it because it was so poorly made at the time that it just wasn't meeting the standards. And that's always when here you see it with some of this beautiful detail. And Art Deco is always interesting for that very reason. Look at some of these pillars and the beautiful ornate decorations on it. All for a school. And it's always intriguing when we consider the fact that these schools were so well adorned and so beautifully decorated. You could actually see this achieving the purpose of inspiring education. As though education was about how to think and not what to think. What to think being what's only in a book or what's cataloged in a book, and you have to abide by anything that's in a book. We like to think that books represent a time when information was more free and it was more open. But is that necessarily true? That's a fallacy of belief that we have to consider. It was a very beautiful building. And of course, we're told that it eroded over time. It started to deteriorate, as all these old world buildings that are somehow miraculously still standing do. And so therefore, they had to renovate it. And this is the renovation. Now, it's nice that the building's still standing, but you can get the feeling that there's something about the renovation that just doesn't quite feel right intuitively. It's almost as though I can hear this building crying out in its pain that this decoration just doesn't seem right. I mean, which one looks more beautiful to you? The interior, though, survives a little bit because we still have one of these beautiful auditoriums, and it looks like the ceiling of the auditorium has been unaltered, and you can see the area around the stage there. That's very gorgeous. I always love the auditoriums in these older schools. And what exactly are they telling us? That's something we have to consider. And now we go to the Hibernia Bank Building, built in 1921. So you could say this is Art Deco or a little pre-Art Deco, depending on what the design philosophy behind it was, or how they decided to designate the building. However, we see a very unique design with a beautiful building that's decorated. It has a pediment up top, and then there's even the little cupola up top. I wonder if that was originally a dome or something else. This is a rather unique building in the fact that we've seen other buildings like this. This somewhat reminds me of the layout of the Plummer Building in Rochester, Minnesota. However, it's unique and beautiful in its own way, especially with this cupola up top. Not a dome, but a little bit of a beehive pattern, it looks like. Hard to tell exactly. I even like the little parapet appearance there above the columns. Very, very unique. And even the pediment itself looks unique. And looking at it from different angles, we can see that no detail was spared. Again, in the 1920s, this was just no problem to throw up a building like this. And this is even before the time of Huey Long, the very famous governor of Louisiana. Ken Burns did a documentary on him too, by the way. And currently, this is apparently a residential complex, and I could see why this would be a beautiful pool to be swimming at, especially if you have that kind of background image with those beautiful pillars and the pediment there. You can see why that would be a very inspiring image. Although I decided to take a look at what renting a room in this building would be. It's a little pricey. Well, look at that column there and that beautiful decorative detail. And this is what one of those one-room apartments would look like, and if the prices are accurate, for the low price of $2,000 a month, you could rent yourself a one-bedroom apartment in the Hibernia Building in New Orleans today. I don't know. I guess it's up to you to decide if it's worth it or not. I think you know where I sit on the matter. Now let's look at the Lakefront Airport. Started construction in 1929 and opened in the mid-1930s. This was supposedly at the orders of Governor Huey Long. What a beautiful airport. Imagine going to an airport like this every day. You know, we think of our modern experiences in airports, and it's just nothing but hassle and difficulty. And yet, just coming to this terminal, you'll say it's smaller, but look at the beautiful decorative detail. The very height of Art Deco buildings. I like all the images and the figures on the front of it. You know, you feel like you're actually going to ascend in the sky, and you can see why this would be an airport that people really want to go to. And then look at the interior of it with the ceiling and the walls and all the beautiful decoration. All this for an airport? I'm not complaining. I mean, I would love to have all of our airports look like this today. You would actually look forward to going to the airport. I have a feeling that the process that you have to go through in the airport would probably be more efficient too. Not that I'm saying that things in the past were better, but, you know, at least from an aesthetic appearance, or at least from an aesthetic aspect, things looked a heck of a lot better. So I don't know, what do you think? How would you feel going to an airport like this every day? And of course, it's also used as a wedding venue, which, as I've joked in other videos, that's kind of our test to know if something's a true old world building. Well, you can get married in this airport, and apparently it's something that they push quite hard. And I could see why. It's very beautiful on the inside, and perfect place to have your reception. Still more detail, and you can see the ceiling a little bit better in this image, and this is definitely a building I would like to get to in person because I have a feeling it's another one of those buildings that gives you that feeling of being inspired on the inside and that it really speaks to your internal energy. Not quite seen an airport like this, you know. How would you get around unless you're going around the big, boring halls with the seats and something that looks like it was designed at the last minute and thrown together, sort of like O'Hare Airport or my personal favorite, LAX. Yeah, LAX. Less said about that, the better. Ursuline Academy, founded in 1727, and this speaks to the French Catholic heritage of New Orleans, as we're told. Another beautiful castle building that was originally used as both a convent. They had several buildings that were part of the convent. It's a very conflicting account. Surprise, surprise. The beautiful building that stands today, though, gives us that impression of the castle, and of course it has to be 3 floors. It has to have very beautiful, well-decorated windows and towers and all the other trappings that we've come to expect on these old world buildings. And here's the chapel portion of it, and this is very beautiful. The interior photos, though, of this building, it looked like it's been renovated quite a bit, so probably a lot of details that have been lost over time or by whatever powers that be. However, the interior beauty of the chapel is quite incredible, and you can see it with the columns there and the beautiful altar. Always something that's amazing in terms of what survives where, and people will just go with the regular explanation, well, it's a church, that's how it's supposed to look. And now let's take a look at the St. Charles hotels. This was the third St. Charles hotel. Don't worry, we'll be looking at the first 2 in due time, but I thought we'd start with the third one because this is the end of the 19th century, and this is a very beautiful hotel. And we have limited pictures of it, but you can see the entryway to it. Yeah, not pulling up your car there, but pulling up your horse and buggy and getting ready to check in. You know, they have the bellhops to help you carry in your luggage from the back of your horse-drawn cart. And again, look at the cobblestone road there. Beautiful entryway, though. And we do have some pictures of the interior. And remember, this is the third St. Charles Hotel, and we see very beautiful columns and the beautiful, well-adorned skylights in the ceiling. And of course, you even see it with the banisters and the handrails. No details spared. And it looks like this would be an incredibly beautiful place to stay in the end of the 19th century, as though you would feel very relaxed, and this truly has a resort feel to it. Compare and contrast this with the modern hotels that we have. Yeah, I'm not thinking you're going to get this experience at the Holiday Inn Express. I mean, maybe you will. But here you see it again with the pillars and the floor, and of course the ceiling as well. I'm just astounded by the fact that there were 3 St. Charles hotels that were told in New Orleans in the 19th century, and that this was the third one that was supposedly constructed in the 1890s. You'll never guess how the previous 2 were lost to us. Look at this. You really get the feeling for the skylight here. And this is the kind of beauty, these are the sort of things that I enjoy seeing in these old buildings. And of course, we don't have the St. Charles Hotel anymore, because why would anybody want this kind of luxury or this kind of experience staying in a hotel? It's interesting to me, though, how this is cataloged and how many of our modern integral journal sources still keep these pictures and still refer to this as a very beautiful building. So even the mainstream seems to agree with our aesthetic appraisal. And here is the first St. Charles Hotel. Unfortunately, it was lost in a fire. Of course. Always the fires that just seem to strike very specific buildings, except for the other fires that strike more wide areas. And I'm sure we're given some story that I'm not going to look up. Here's the Toro Synagogue, early 20th century. Haven't really featured many synagogues on the channel, but this is a very beautiful building with an incredible dome, and for some reason I'm reminded of the Pantheon in Rome. But this is very gorgeous, and it looks like this building has survived today, although I'd like to get on the ground and verify some things with it. And look at the beautiful large-scale window and the way it's laid out. It's not a traditional design, and yet in some other respects it is. Interior photos for this were a little hard to come by, and I couldn't really verify if this is the actual interior of the Toro Synagogue, but it looks like it is. And look at some of the beautiful columns there and the interior. And you even have a pediment on the interior. So again, no detail spared. Some of these surviving buildings that harken back to an earlier civilization. And let's look at the St. Louis Cathedral, founded in 1720. Yes, I'm doing that intentionally because I've got to get back at Christopher Lambert for making fun of my French pronunciations or lack of capability in pronouncing French pronunciations. This is one of the most iconic buildings of New Orleans, though, the St. Louis Cathedral. And supposedly the towers have been renovated and changed many different times. And you see the central tower and the 2 subsidiary towers. Originally, they supposedly weren't pointed. They were a little bit more rounded. And yet you see the columns in the front facade and the buildings around it with a pediment on it. And I think this reflects the original old world identity that still survives to this day from New Orleans. And I think this is one of the reasons why New Orleans is one of the most incredible examples of a true old world city. Yes, you might have noticed they've tried to conceal it by building new buildings such as the lovely current City Hall from the 1950s. but so much of it still endures. And looking at the interior of this cathedral, we're just struck by the incredible beauty. We're struck by the fact that the ceiling is so well decorated, and this building is so unbelievably old. Yet it's been renovated and changed and rebuilt many times, but how old is it really? And I'm still wondering, in the design and construction of it, you don't really see many other cathedrals like it, at least in the United States. But of course people say, well, it's because they were inspired by the decoration in Europe. Of course they were. Here's a little bit of a video from it, and just looking up at the ceiling, you can see the incredible arcs and all the columns and detail with it. And of course the checkerboard floor. Seems to be a recurring pattern. We had a cotton expo in New Orleans in 1884 to 1885, another one of our great World's Fairs. And no shortage of questionable or conflicting events with it as well. I mean, look at that beautiful large building there. Are we going to be told that that was a temporary structure built with sticks and sucker sticks and lollipops and balsa wood and stucco? Part of a slew of World's Fairs that was going on at that time, and people have asked me if I'm aware that there were always World's Fairs going on all over the world in the 19th century, and yes, I'm aware of it, which makes it even more interesting. Why is it that there seemed to be such a push for this, and yet today when you go to a fair, you'll be lucky to see some tents and the existing wooden buildings that have always been there? The Cotton Expo, though, was no exception to the World's Fairs, because we have the usual very large, magnificent building that seems to be the center point, but then a lot of other subsidiary buildings, and of course we'll be told that millions of people descended upon this World's Affair because traveling in the 19th century was no problem. Yes, I said World's Affair because I think that's a more appropriate term for this. And what exactly is going on with these displays? Are we really seeing the aspects of the cotton industry in the 19th century, or are we seeing something else? So we can look at the official accounts, but when we look at the pictures, we always seem to have a conflicting account with what we're told. Very, very beautiful, and showcasing the supposed wonderful industrial capability of the South in the United States. And keep in mind that this was only 20 years after the U.S. Civil War, and New Orleans was featured quite prominently in the Civil War, as it was considered the main gateway to the Mississippi, which, given its geographic location, makes perfect sense. Not exactly sure what's going on with this little gazebo building here as this little display. This doesn't look like any sort of temporary structure, and I thought it was interesting to highlight. What do you think this is? What exactly are these columns or these pillars with it? And you see little arches in it. I'm not really sure what to make of this. Actual photos of this expo are very difficult to come by, but this is supposedly one of the photos of the main building. And that's right, made out of your balsa wood and your leftover popsicle sticks, no problem. So easy to construct and so easy to tear down, because we just had all the time and resources in the 19th century and no logistical limitations. And now we're going to look at Aurelian's lost building list, starting with the Church of Messiah in 1853. All these buildings that we're going to be looking at now are no longer with us, but they did exist in New Orleans according to the official account, and we have pictures. And what a beautiful building. Very gorgeous, and again, something unique when it comes to the design and construction of religious buildings. The Parish Prison, 1834. Very nice prison. Although I think of the one that we saw in Anamosa, Iowa, while it may not compare completely to that, it's still very impressive with a little cupola over there. And why do you need that on a prison? Very interesting. First Presbyterian, 1857. And look at the tower on that beauty. It's a real tragedy that this building's still not with us, because it's a religious building, and you'd like to think that we venerate religious figures and we have a respect for religion, although you'll find interesting historical accounts where that's not always the case, especially in the United States in the 19th century. We always have the Protestants going at the Catholics and vice versa. The first St. Charles Hotel, built in 1835. Look at this gorgeous building. This looks like a state capitol. And of course, this is one that was lost to fire. Beautiful dome, columns all over the place, and the beautiful pediment. It was stated that this is one of the most beautiful buildings in the United States at the time. Of course, that's the official account. And who knows what the ground truth reality is. Still, a hotel. They're saying this was a hotel in the 19th century. Imagine if we could get a hotel built like this today. Well, this one vanished by fire, supposedly in the 1850s, so they replaced it with this one, the second St. Charles Hotel. Looks just like the first one, minus the dome on top. So what's really going on here? Again, another conflicting account. I'm not sure what to make of this. The second St. Charles Hotel, though, was actually used during the Civil War as the headquarters of the military governor of New Orleans, and that's Major General Benjamin Butler. Yes, Benjamin Butler, who was the military governor, dictator of New Orleans during the Civil War. And he had some very controversial policies, although his authoritarian and oppressive leadership style did help reduce the outbreak of fever in New Orleans, which it was supposedly susceptible to. This guy looks kind of familiar. He almost looks like someone took actor Dennis Franz and melted him in the microwave for a few minutes. I have to wonder if Benjamin Butler ever served in some sort of official capacity as the governor of Wisconsin or perhaps the mayor of Madison. His authoritarian policies would go very popular there. What's he wearing there? Is that supposed to be some kind of uniform? That's very interesting. Where have I seen that before? Oh yeah, those dress uniforms in Star Trek The Next Generation. I was wondering where they got that idea from. Quick, number one, put on your butler uniform. Luxana Troy is coming again. All right, back on topic. French Opera House, 1910. And again, we see the surrounding roadways there, and we always have these opera houses that seem to be in every large city and small town across the United States from the 19th century. Everybody needed to have an opera house. Even if your town only had 300 people, you needed to have an opera house. You weren't getting in the stagecoach and riding over to the nearby town. Oh no. You had to have the opera house there. How could you even have enough acts to go around all these opera houses? Gilbert Academy, 1888. Look at the tower on that. That's very unique. And of course, the central construction there. You know, if this was in another state, we'd probably be told this is a school for the blind or a school for the deaf. Because, you know, if there's one thing blind people need to help them get around, it's multiple floor buildings. Yes, don't question that one. And the Horticulture Hall, one of the remnants, lost buildings from the Cotton Exposition or the Centennial Exposition or whatever name you want to assign to it. Very beautiful building. And again, something else that unfortunately we've lost because of the natural progression, the renewal as we'll call it, in the United States. The Inn Terminal, 1902, very interesting. And we have this large, what looks to be a hangar. Of course, we'll be told that this is just a cover area for a train station. Wonder why this one was lost. Very interesting tower. And, you know, you need to have a 3 or 4 floor tower so you can actually run a proper train station, I guess. Well, let me know in the comments what you think this building really is, because I always enjoy hearing your opinions on it, because I think you're very accurate with some of your impressions. And now looking at the Moresque building. Built in 1859, but they had to stop it during the Civil War, and I guess Benjamin Butler was not giving any authoritarian or oppressive orders to continue construction on this building, but they managed to complete it right after the Civil War. Very unique and very beautiful. And what architectural style does this represent, I wonder? Not something that we see a lot of. The Public Library in 1908. Yes, little dome there, pediment in the columns. You know, the only public library I've seen that really matches this one in bizarre factor has to be the one I looked at in La Crosse, Wisconsin, way back in one of the early explorations, the one that looked like it was lifted from some sort of fairy tale. And I like, again, how you have the stairs that go up to the main entrance. So why don't all public libraries still look like this today? Not sure. The Orleans Parish Criminal Courts, 1880s. And look at that beautiful clock tower and numerous towers on that. Well, of course you need a court building that looked like that at the time. It gives all the people that are coming in there to have their judgments read to them the feeling that they're going into a building that reflects authority. And of course you have a large clock tower on it at the time. And people tell me, well, it's so people could check their time, because nobody had pocket watches in the 19th century. Got a video coming up on that as well. The second Masonic Temple, built in 1892. Wonder what the first one looked like. Again, no detail spared there with the beautiful large windows and the incredible towers. Again, many different architectural styles, and you know, for this particular exploration, I'm not so concerned about what they're labeling these as, whether it's Gothic, Victorian Revival, Imperial, or whatever. Southern Rail Depot, 1908. Look at the intricacy with this one. And you see some of these large mason stones and the interesting foundation, and then look at the front window on this. This isn't exactly the kind of building that I'm certainly used to seeing. Very unique. A railway depot that looks like that. And the Toro Shakespeare Almshouse, 1882. Almshouse was basically the way they said poorhouse. And of course you need a very well-built, unique poorhouse or almshouse with the large portal windows. And looks like it's 3 floors. I wonder what the foundation's like, and I wonder how deep in the foundation it really goes. Very intriguing. And Temple Sinai, built 1872. 1872. Gorgeous building like this being built in New Orleans. Very tragic that we don't have this building to still go see, because I would love to see the interior of this, and I could not find any interior photos of this beautiful building. But what do you think of it? Well, that concludes our exploration of New Orleans, and as General Charlton Heston, Andrew Jackson said, we have an incredible city here, and he successfully defended it in the War of 1812, one of the few American victories from that war. I wonder, am I going to be lampooned for my poor pronunciation of French words for the rest of my life? Thanks for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring one of the quintessential smoking gun pieces of evidence for the Tartaria theory, and that is the mud flood. The mud flood, it is really the smoking gun because there are a lot of variations of the evidence that indicate that some sort of mud flood occurred. Naturally, the mainstream has a variety of interesting responses to this theory, and even though there is a wide variety of evidence, which ranges from images, of course, we know what we can say about images and how they can be altered, yet we also have actual structures that we can look at and examine, and ascertain that something happened to them that indicates that they were mud flooded. Not images, but structures that you can really go and look at today and determine may have been subjected to some sort of forces which involved the land changing, the ground being liquefied, or liquefaction as it's called, and that liquefaction spreading all over the land in many different locations. The intention of this exploration is to examine what caused the mud flood, and then why did it happen. However, we're going to conduct this exploration with a different approach. We are going to intentionally look at what the skeptics say about the mud flood and how they respond to the theory of Tartaria. It's always very interesting and, I'll admit, somewhat entertaining to do, but I think it's important to consider the views of others, because if you just dismiss the views of others, then oftentimes that's the very antithesis of the true scientific approach. And if you look at these images of the mud flood, these are no doubt the most dramatic images, and of course these are constructed. Yet at the same time, we have many photos and are well aware of many buildings that have very deep foundations that defy simple explanation. You may have seen the Salt Lake Temple in Utah, and you can think of many other buildings that you've seen in the course of your travels that suddenly have these signs of being mud-flooded buildings. We're also going to look at a couple in this exploration. So let's start by examining what the skeptics have to say about the mud flood. Now let's take a look and see what the skeptics have to say about Tartaria and the mud flood, from this article by Brian Dunning. And don't worry, we'll be taking a look at his biography here at the end of the article. Filed under history and pseudo-history and natural history. And we know what they mean when they say pseudo, don't we? Yes. Oh, apparently you can subscribe to this on a podcast and listen on Apple and listen on Spotify. Well, it's a written article, so rather than subjecting you to that, I think I'll just read it and we'll examine it. Lovely picture, and you can see why I selected this picture. It's a great picture that depicts a potential mud flood. But let's see what our self-described skeptic has to tell us. In recent years, a new alternative world history claim has arisen from the internet, as though the internet's some sort of self-aware entity, and it's a doozy. It revolves around an alleged worldwide cataclysm believed by adherents to have taken place sometime in the 1800s, a disaster that wiped out a worldwide advanced civilization and allowed the nations as we know them today to rise up. The event was a mud flood, in quotations, in which several meters of mud washed in and buried the ground levels of houses and buildings everywhere. Those cities and towns that were partially buried constituted the worldwide advanced civilization called Tartaria, which had free wireless energy and was populated, at least in part, by giants. So he's taking parts of the theory and suggesting that that's what applies to everybody, naturally. It was a civilization reset. Out with the old, in with the new, and that new civilization is us. If this sounds too silly to be worth anyone's time to even listen to, then consider the fact that of all the hundreds of topic suggestions in the Skeptoid key, this is the one that I chose for this week, and I chose it for good reason. So attend. Interesting that he has to convince his own followers to listen, but I understand. It's all about a convincing game, isn't it? Especially when we're talking about skeptics. Let us begin by surveying the evidence put forth for what some adherents call mud flood theory, and this takes us about 12 seconds to do. Brian, you're showing us what a brilliant mind that you have and telling us that you're going to dismiss this in 12 seconds. You're not even going to consider it. So we know that you're based on hard beliefs. Well, let's see what takes 12 seconds to cover the mud flood theory. Find any old-timey black and white photo where people are digging, particularly if there's an old steam shovel or mule teams being employed, and it doesn't even matter what they're digging, you can say they're digging out from the great depth of mud that covered their city. Then find any modern photograph of any old building that has floors below grade, especially if it has basement windows peeking out, or if there's excavation going on next door, which has exposed its basement walls or foundations, and say that the building's lower levels were obviously buried by mud. I don't want to sound dismissive, but that is indeed the entirety of the evidence that has motivated these people to discard all of known history and embrace this alternative version. You know what, Brian? You are absolutely right, because all of known history is verified and certified by multiple sources, and none of them have ever gotten anything wrong, have they? Despite the fact that our government was preceded by numerous governments that we're told are corrupt. But that's okay, Brian. I'm with you on this one, okay? I can follow you. As far as the previous civilization being named Tartaria goes, this part is more interesting. As you may or may not know, Tartars was the generic name used by Europeans up until the middle of the 19th century for the people who inhabited the largely unexplored regions of Asia, including what we now know as Manchuria, Siberia, and Central Asia. Many pre-20th century world maps showed these regions labeled simply as Tartary. Actually, you can find many maps that call it Tartaria, but that's all right. We'll ignore that. And as geographical knowledge gradually increased, Manchurian Mongolia became Chinese Tartary, Siberia became Great Tartary, and Central Asia became Independent Tartary. So again, ignore all those maps that say Tartaria on them. Good call there, Brian. These placeholder names quickly dropped out of use as the true place names and nations became known. However, today most people have no idea that such a large part of the world was called Tartary relatively recently. Really? And when you watch a YouTube video showing so many old maps boldly labeling Central Eurasia with an unfamiliar name, it can be pretty surprising. In fact, it can be so surprising that it might leave a person open to an astounding explanation for it, such as mud flood theory. Interesting in all this diatribe, I haven't seen any actual refuting of this. Well, maybe he'll get to it. I hesitate to overuse the term conspiracy theory. Ooh, there he goes. Because it's often misused to refer to anything from UFO stories to urban legends to actual conspiracies. So Brian is admitting that there are actual conspiracies. Well, that's good to know. But this is indeed one. Of course it is, because you disagree with it, so you label it a conspiracy theory. You're following, Brian. Believers claim that this ancient history of Tartaria as an advanced civilization and of the mud flood that destroyed it are covered up by today's world governments. They conspire to keep it a secret and to keep historians teaching a false history, the version you and I know. Because, of course, it can't be false history because it's what you know, Brian, right? I agree. The reason for this is not at all made clear so far as I could find, but nevertheless, a conspiracy theory it is. Tartaria and the mud flood is truly a 21st century conspiracy theory, in that it exists almost entirely on the internet, if not entirely. That's funny. It doesn't exist on the internet when I go out and I do my explorations in person, and the people that I collaborate with face to face, but that's all right. He's making broad sweeping comments, and you can't blame him for doing that. While some parts of the narrative go back centuries, and we'll talk about those, the whole thing as a single consolidated claim only goes back to around 2017. Yes, Brian knows exactly where it all started. Of course he does. August of 2016 is when the first videos began to appear on YouTube about the mud flood idea, and we know this because of tools such as Google Trends. Yes, those good old Google Trends. They will tell you everything, won't they? This is a tool that allows you to see the popularity of specific Google search terms over time, because there's no other search engine, right? And there's no other means of acquiring information. And nobody goes to the library in person. No, not at all. When we search for mud flood or mud flood theory or Tartaria, And again, he doesn't acknowledge that that term is actually seen on the maps, but why should he? We learned that the internet was essentially devoid of any interest in these things until about December of 2018. That is completely untrue, but that's okay. You can just say whatever you want to. Ever since then, there has been mounting interest in those subjects among internet users. Now, it is true, it has spread across the internet, but that's the whole point of the internet. And you have to wonder, is this something that was originally intended to be misinformation, but now it's gone too far? We can compare and contrast what happened in the 1970s with all of the alternative research, which a lot of people probably correctly summarize is information that was intentionally released to the public to mislead them. But there was never any sort of hitting the brakes really hard in the 1980s or 1990s. They just sort of let all these alternative research theories sort of die out and disprove them over time or claim that they did, and just some of them they let linger. YouTube is what drives a lot of these pop culture trends on the internet, so we should expect that when we go to YouTube and do a search for videos on those subjects that were posted in that date range, we're probably going to find at least one early influential video. Long-time Skeptoid listeners might remember that this is exactly how we found the original YouTube upload that constituted the case zero for the Finland does not exist conspiracy theory. Interesting. I haven't heard of that one myself, but so be it. Applying the same methodology here, I did find a YouTube user, Philip Drugenin, who had been posting videos about a mud flood since August of 2016. At first, there wasn't much interest in his videos. They had very low viewership, that is, until December 2018, January 2019. And what exactly changed? The same time that Google Trends reported the internet became aware of the subject. Because Google Trends were able to ascertain that. Intriguing. Drugenin had an enormous spike in his downloads right at that time. Which one triggered which? I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. Lots of conspiracy theorists have made mud flood videos, and it makes no difference who was the lucky one to get the early traction. What matters is that this is when the subject first became a thing. Yes, because no one ever did alternative research. No one ever had alternative theories in the history of humanity, right, Brian? Of course not. But taking Drugenin's YouTube channel just as one representative example, the descriptions on his videos and his Facebook postings indicate run-of-the-mill, broad-spectrum conspiracy mongering. Isn't it interesting how he says conspiracy mongering and doesn't say conspiracy theory mongering? Because remember, conspiracies are legitimate. And of course, we have the usual suspects that he alludes to that everyone always tries to assign to anybody who does alternative research, because that's one of the easiest ways to discredit such things and to make sure people are not thinking what they're not supposed to be thinking. Make no mistake, Tartaria and the mud flood does not come from historians or archaeologists or geologists. It comes from the darkest underbelly of internet conspiracy theory culture. Thus, we might be tempted to stop here and say that it's not worth the trouble of a debunking. And in many cases, that would be correct. But here we're seeing an almost unbelievable growth in popularity. Look at any of the videos or search any of the forums where mud flood theory is discussed, and you'll see that a depressing number of people fully embrace it. So here's what it all boils down to. Here's his true thesis. People are not thinking the way they're supposed to be thinking, and he's here to put a stop to it. The number of YouTube videos promoting it as fact continues to rise, and some of them have download counts in the millions. So let this episode, in particular its transcript page with the high Google ranking according to all Skeptoid episode transcript pages, so now we're just talking about numbers and that proves everything. Where have I heard that before? Serve as an alternative destination for those using the internet to seek out more information on Tartaria and the mud flood. Yes, the Skeptoid site seems very legitimate. Now, obviously, it requires little more than awareness of the existence of basements and sub-basements to accept many of these photographs without being forced to throw out all of world history and insist upon the existence of an ancient advanced civilization. Watching the YouTube videos, I recognize at least one other photograph as depicting a time when Seattle raised some of its street levels, burying many first floors in the process, in order to reduce the steepness of some of the city's hills. Yes, and these are videos that have been covered quite extensively by other researchers. Why don't we take a break here from Brian's brilliant account here and take a look at some photos of Seattle from the time frame that he's talking about. Let's step back here from the skeptic's perception and let's try to look at things a little bit more objectively. In other words, just looking at things and using our own minds instead of just abiding by what Brian here tells us we're supposed to think. All right, so let's just look at this account of flattening hills to build Seattle, 1905 to 1930. Now, as you look at these images, remember, We are told that this was all something that was done in the following account. Starting in 1897 and continuing through 1930, the hilly topography of central Seattle was radically altered by a series of regrades in what might have been the largest such alteration of urban terrain at the time. Probably it's still the largest such alteration of urban terrain ever. Why let that stop us? The regrading strategy was adopted for one main reason: economics. The idea was that reshaping the land would open up the city to more commerce. The earliest urban planners for the city believed that if the streets were at regular angles and at a level elevation, business would thrive. Interesting. Engineers and workers moved mountains, straightened rivers, leveled hillsides, dug sewers, paved roads, and carved canals as part of making Seattle. As Clarence Bagley wrote in his 1916 History of Seattle, "No great city on the American continent has overcome so many natural obstacles encountered in its growth." Seattle, Bagley concluded, was literally one vast reclamation project. You know what? I'm thinking Bagley was being quite honest when he said it was a vast reclamation project. These regrading projects began after the 1889 fire that destroyed much of Seattle's downtown retail district. Of course, it always starts with a fire. After the blaze, city engineer R.H. Thompson initiated an ambitious plan to reinvigorate the city. He convinced the municipal government to level hills, fill tidelands, straighten the Duwamish River, and purchase the Cedar River watershed. Most of these projects were completed between 1890 and 1930, when Seattle matched Bagley's description of a city under near constant construction. Now, when you look at these photos, do these photos really paint the picture of constant construction? Do you really think that something like this kind of excavation project would be possible even today if we devoted the resources of the entire state of Washington, or for that matter, the entire West Coast? Or why stop there? The entire United States of America devoted every single excavator, every single worker it had. Do you think this would be possible to do in this timeline now if this was attempted? And for that matter, why don't cities do this now? I mean, if that's all you need to do to increase property value and economics, then just do this kind of work. Look at the cool things that you can do and achieve at this time frame. And Brian Dunning doesn't question this. To him, these photos are solid proof that this unfolded exactly as we're told. It doesn't matter that it doesn't make sense, and the how is irrelevant. You don't ask questions when you're Brian Dunning. You accept everything as you are told. So what do you think of Brian Dunning's assertion that this was simply a massive earth-moving project in Seattle? Yes, it took him a few decades, but do you really think it's practicable? And one thing I'll say is I don't think Brian Dunning would ever ask you questions. He's going to tell you what to think, and you better think what he tells you to think. It's the word, and it's good because it comes from Brian Dunning. Moving on. Similar earth-moving projects have been undertaken in cities all around the world, particularly in the decades around the turn of the 20th century, when streetcars and automobiles quite suddenly came into wide use and required regrading in areas that were already developed. Yes, like New York City, for example. Manhattan had to do a massive regrading project, didn't they? This is one reason you can go to virtually any large old city and find underground tours and such. You see, it's got a rational explanation. It was all just the regrading. The regrading is how they established the subway system in New York City, right? Given these few facts about urban buildings, there remains no evidence at all that anything like a worldwide mud flood buried cities everywhere. Of course not, Brian, because you said so. I know better than to question you. Now this gets better. Quizzically, interesting word there, many of the photographs I found in the YouTube videos and web forums depict Robert Wadlow. Yeah, we depicted him in an earlier video last week, didn't we? The tallest person in history at 272 centimeters, 8 feet 11, who died in 1940. His identity is never given on these web pages. I recognized him simply because he's easily recognizable and his photos are generally well known. But I couldn't figure out what the conspiracy theorists might thought he had to do with the mud flood. Wadlow was born in 1918 and died quite young, so his photos show him with antique cars, clothing, and street scenes. Recalling that the mud flood is claimed to have happened in the 1800s, my guess is that these photos appear to some undereducated people, because you're not undereducated, no, not at all, to be from about that time period, thus making Wadlow one of the giants who lived in Tartaria. Photos of other people affected with the gigantism are also shown, always old black and white photos. It seems clear that the believers considered photos of Wadlow and others like him to be the Tartarian giants that populated the earth prior to their presumed demise in the mud flood. Now, official statement from this channel, there may have been giants, there may not have been giants. We just don't know. But you're not going to see anything like that in this kind of article. You are going to be told exactly what to think, and you're not going to be asked what you think because that's not important. Paradoxically, it's this introduction of a maximally implausible story element like giants, because Earth moving in a short amount of time in cities all across the world is not an implausible story. No, that makes perfect sense, right? Like giants, that gives Tartaria and the Mud Flood its closest thing to an element of legitimacy. This is because stories of giants actually are ancient. And then he goes about to talk about the texts of virtually every culture throughout history regarding giants, and quite accurately so. And we've talked about that on the channel before. To a lesser extent, the whole idea of a great flood that resets civilization is another way believers try to link this particular claim to the classics. I say to a lesser extent because legendary floods like that of Noah were said to truly obliterate everything, while this new alleged mud flood simply dumped a meter or two of mud around buildings and was relatively easily removed by workers shown in old photographs. This raises a few points that are not very persuasively argued, in my opinion. Yes, it is your opinion, at least you're being honest there. For example, why did burying only the ground floors of buildings cause society to lose its advanced technology, like free wireless energy? Why did it kill only all the giants, presumably the only people tall enough to have not been buried by it? Where did all this mud come from, and where did it go? Why was the alleged nation of Tartaria the only one that did not survive? Why did the Tartarian giants live in houses and buildings the same size as ours? Yeah, he's really doing the hand wave, isn't he? If all the world's nations are conspiring to cover this up, why are so many YouTubers and bloggers allowed to freely reveal everything without consequences? You know what? That's actually a great question, and I'll address it right now. Because when you have confusion and when you have uncertainty, people tend to adhere to authority, and they will do as they are told. That is exactly why it's allowed to happen. And it also gives a little bit of legitimacy to it. Besides, why would you be saying that, Brian? I mean, isn't that what your entire skeptoid site is based on, is shooting down these crazed conspiracy theories, as you call them, but then you also call them conspiracy. So which is it? You do know the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory, right? And you do know that only a scientist or a historian is officially certified to tell us what the difference is between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Okay, I digress. And of course, the perennial question for all such conspiracy theories, oh, there he goes, what exactly are all today's national leaders gaining by covering up this event? But let us not push these questions too hard for fear of collapsing the card house that is Tartaria and the Mud Flood. Oh, and he even signs it. Great signature there. What's this Brian Dunning character even look like, I wonder? Oh, that's an interesting picture of him. Here we go. Here's what he looks like. Brian Dunning. I'm a science writer and author. So he's not a scientist, he's a science writer, which means journalist. And also the executive director of Skeptoid Media. This whole site is mostly my gig. I have a press page here, and my personal site is here. You can also follow me on Twitter, and all the other social media stuff too. Oh, that sounds like the internet, but I thought the internet was this entity that was generating all these crazy conspiracy theories. Okay, never mind. I live in Bend, Oregon, and can be found sometimes inside my Jeep, but often underneath it. Well, that's an interesting little bio. For the record, I don't bear any ill will towards Mr. Brian Dunning. I just find his approach a little peculiar. He wants to assert in his article that anyone who doesn't think the way he thinks must be undereducated and they must be fools. And you'll see that same approach from anybody who doesn't want to consider any alternative methods of thinking or even theories. There's only one way you're supposed to think, and if you don't think that way, then you're going to be classified a fool or undereducated, as was stated in the article. I'm fully willing to concede that it is possible that what Brian Dunning stated in his article could have happened. I don't think it's very likely. I find it very difficult to believe, or perhaps there's some other option or theory that's in between the mud flood and what he asserts is just a city that was conducting some massive landscaping projects for a couple decades because, they just had nothing better to do and had infinite resources, because that's kind of what you have to accept. But maybe it's something else in between. I would never insult Brian Dunning, and I would certainly never question his education level. I'm sure he would give me the same consideration if he was aware of what theories I assert. I think I recognize Brian Dunning, and this picture looks familiar in some way. He bears a striking resemblance to Dick Jones from the first RoboCop movie. But let's be honest, Ronnie Cox is still with us, and he's doing great, the actor who portrayed Dick Jones. Maybe somebody else? Oh, Patrick McGoogan from The Prisoner. Yes, he bears a very striking resemblance to Patrick McGoogan. A wonderful 1960s TV series, The Prisoner, which Patrick McGoogan starred in as the secret agent who was seized by an unknown entity and forced to endure brainwashing experiments as they tried to find out why he resigned. It would never work, though, with Brian Dunning in The Prisoner. For one, he would never resign from a government agency as a secret agent. And two, even if he did find himself in the village to be brainwashed and tortured to find out what he knew, he would probably give in right away because he'd see himself as a deviant and he needed to be cured. Therefore, he would simply submit to all the terrifying procedures that they wanted to do on him, and the show would be over in about 5 minutes. No, let's cut right to the chase here. Brian Dunning is Dr. Zaius, Minister of Science and Chief Defender of the Faith. Yes, those roles are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're mutually inclusive. This is someone who is certified and accredited to tell you exactly what to think. And there is no debating what they think. And you dare not go against what they tell you is the good word. Because if you try to counter any point that they make, you'll find yourself facing a grand tribunal. Mr. Dunning will be leading this tribunal with 2 of his cronies on either side, and they'll give you this kind of image. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. You are not allowed to make any sort of counterpoint, and what he says is the good word. Therefore it is truth, and therefore it cannot be questioned, because he's also a labeled skeptic, much as Dr. Zaius was. And then after you face your tribunal and you're found guilty, you will then have to spend some personal time with him, and he will grant you the grand extolling of all of his great historical knowledge and his understanding of how things truly are, and he will insult you relentlessly. And then you'll be reminded of what your proper place in society is. So leaving Dr. Zaius behind, we have to consider the fact that soil liquefaction is something that really happens. It's very well documented. Naturally, we'll be given a variety of reasons for why it happens, why soil behaves like a liquid. It's due to something in the ground. It's an earthquake. It's a natural process. It only happens in isolated incidences. Yet we see many different examples of it, and we see buildings such as this that have been stuck in the ground for a very long time. Of course, we'll be told it's well documented and was merely the result of an earthquake that turned the soil into liquid. There is no other explanation for it. Do not trust your eyes, trust what we're telling you. But how many images do we have to see? How many accounts do we have to read before we start to ask questions? Dr. Zaius will tell us that we're just supposed to think exactly as he's told to think, or as we're told to think, and not ask questions. However, there's just too many examples to where we can't afford to ask questions, because then we're just simply accepting things at face value, which is exactly what Dr. Zaius wants, and I'm not one to go along with Dr. Zaius. We see so many images with so many different buildings that have the clear signs that they've been subjected to traumatic forces. We also see different types of markings on the wall, and we'll be given a variety of reasons. We'll typically be told this is natural erosion, or these are the forces of nature, and not the forces of some sort of mud flood. That's just absurd. Yet, how many different examples do you need to see? How many different accounts do we need to read before we start to see that we simply can't continuously dismiss it, no matter how much we're insulted or how much we're threatened? And that's really where the crux of this research comes from. A building such as this, that really gives you the classic example of a mud flood. And I chose this innocuous building intentionally because it has all the classic signs. Yet you can find mud flood buildings just about everywhere you look. Of course, it'll be dismissed by people like Dr. Zaius as saying that you're simply looking for things that aren't really there. But I ask you, what's your impression when you see this image? When you see this done to a building, do you really think that this is something that was just the result of some sort of excavation that occurred? Or that there's no reason for an explanation on this building for why this looks like this? Are you willing to just let it go, and does it really not matter because there's other more important things in life to pursue? Or is having awareness important, and being willing to ask questions and really seek your own answers and determine your own theories? That's actually the very heart of what being an explorer truly is. It's not being afraid to seek your own answers. And there are many people, led by Dr. Zaius and many others, who don't want you to even seek your own answers. And they will gladly insult you, and they will happily mock you. And let them. Because at the end of the day, when you're able to find your own answers, this is how you're able to truly find out who you really are and come to your own answers. What's the real end game of this alternative research? Well, the end game really comes down to the fact that we need to achieve self-awareness, and we need to find what it is that makes us truly unique. And everyone out there will try to tell us that we're not unique. And in fact, the very science fiction film that I referenced Dr. Zaius from, it even tried to tell us that human beings are not so great and the apes are always better. Although to be fair to the entire series, it did show that the apes had many of the same tendencies to engage in violence and inflicting in self-harm. So what's my theory for how the mud flood happened and why? You might recall an exploration that we did early in the channel concerning Holy Hill in Wisconsin. This is a cathedral that they call a basilica, the terms seem to be interchangeable, but a very large and well-built church that's on a hill in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin. It's far outside the outer suburbs of Milwaukee. And yet, when we look closely at this cathedral, this basilica, this church, we see the usual construction cues, the large towers, the beautiful window. We see potentially the ability to project some other form of technology, some other form of sound, or the process that's been brought up a couple times on previous live streams of the channel called cymatics are a subset of modal vibrational phenomena. We don't exactly know what causes them, but it shows in these different patterns. Could this be something to do with sound or some technology we don't understand that was emitted through sound from these once great cathedrals, these churches that we see? And this can cause these patterns. Perhaps another application of this technology is that it caused the actual soil liquefaction on a level we couldn't possibly understand. Consider all the churches that you see, the churches that are on a hill, the churches that are in large cities or in great municipalities, and yet at the same time, churches are not just confined to large cities with their incredible organs, their towers, and their amazing windows, which we speculate could be used to project some form of vibrational frequencies. We see churches in every small town and village. There's even a small town called Arcadia in western Iowa that's never had a population of more than 500 in its entire recorded history since 1880, and yet it has two very large churches, both on hills. Everywhere we look across the land, you'll see that there are churches or buildings that we're told have a religious function, and yet there's many similarities in the layouts. Towers and windows and incredible construction. We're told and conditioned to believe that these religious edifices are potentially sanctuaries or places where one could seek a sanctuary, and you'll find it in different forms of fiction, that churches are a place of holy ground, just as other religious edifices in the other faiths across the land are. Yet at the same time, is it possible that all these churches survived because they were meant to, that they were positioned in a location to where they could broadcast the frequency or induce cymatics, that somehow their original purpose of defense for the old civilization was subverted or sabotaged, and they were used to induce the mud flood? That's one very solid theory, and I think the numerous locations of these religious edifices across the land and their unique personal locations, oftentimes on hills or in, how shall you say, commanding positions on the terrain, they could have very easily broadcast these frequencies and caused this breakdown of the soil or this soil liquefaction using some process of cymatics, some process of vibrational frequencies that we don't understand. Even the great Cathedral of Cologne, that thing survived 2 world wars. It seems as though these buildings were meant to last and endure. And it's very difficult to find even an unused church, and granted I'm just talking about the United States here and more recent experiences, that's ever been torn down. If a church is unused, the building remains standing. And of course, what do you have inside every church? You have a very large and impressive organ. It seems as though it's the layout of projecting sound. And this goes for the edifices of other faiths as well. Projecting sound seems to be very important. Now, granted, this is just a theory. It could be wrong, and yet every time you go around and you see the layout of these religious buildings being similar, with the ability to project sound or in some way influence vibrational frequency, then that really gives a lot of credence to the fact that this was how the mud flood was induced. And why was the mud flood induced? Simple. Because if you have a mud flood, it makes it a lot easier to reset the civilization. It enables you to conceal the greatness of the buildings. It also allows a different civilization to control exactly what's going to be released and what's not going to be shared with the general population. And perhaps it was an initial attempt to destroy the enclaves of the population that did not go along with the reset. But there are many theories. What are your theories? Please let me know what you think in the comments. And yes, I want to know what you think, and yes, it is perfectly okay to disagree with me. Please let me know.